My sister-in-law stole my $120,000 house fund to buy her yacht, but she had no idea it was my corporate LLC tax money. She just smiled, swirling the ice in her bourbon glass, while I stood in the center of my mother's living room holding a bank statement that read zero. The fireplace behind her crackled, casting a warm, flickering glow over her fresh acrylic nails and the heavy diamond tennis bracelet that certainly hadn't been on her wrist last week. "You're acting like we robbed a bank, Charmaine," Brittany said, her voice dripping with the kind of practiced condescension usually reserved for retail workers, taking a slow sip of her drink without breaking eye contact. "It's family money. Preston and I needed the liquidity for the down payment on the Beverly Hills property, and the yacht rental was for networking because you have to spend money to make money in our circles." I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked down at the crisp white paper trembling slightly in my hand that read, "A transfer out of exactly $120,000 destined for Preston and Britt Prestige Realty LLC." "My signature was forged," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, not bouncing off the walls but seeming to absorb into the heavy velvet curtains of my parents' Chicago suburb home. "Oh, stop being so dramatic," my brother Preston scoffed from the leather recliner, not even having the decency to sit up straight, wearing the same smug, untouchable smirk he had when we were teenagers at 44 years old. He crossed his ankles, revealing designer loafers that I had likely just paid for, and casually explained, "I told you, I'll pay you back when the real estate flips. We just needed a bridge loan. And besides, you're single. You have no kids, no husband. So what do you need a house for right now anyway when you're fine in your apartment?" The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, because a bridge loan requires a request, an agreement and a contract. But what he had done was walk into the local branch where the teller knew our family name, presented my old Social Security card, and utilized a forged power of attorney document to drain an account he had absolutely no legal right to touch. Before we continue, let me know where you're listening from today in the comments, and tell me if you have ever stood in a room full of your own blood relatives and realized, with terrifying clarity, that they view you not as a human being, but as a resource to be harvested. Because in that moment, looking at my brother's relaxed posture, I realized something far more sinister than the theft itself. He wasn't afraid, Brittany wasn't afraid, and they were completely effortlessly comfortable with destroying my future to fund their weekend. But what turned my blood to absolute ice wasn't Preston's entitlement, it was the sound of my mother, Evelyn, clearing her throat from the kitchen archway as she walked in. Wiping her hands on a floral dish towel, her face arranged in a mask of irritated impatience. She didn't look at the fraudulent bank statement in my hand. She looked at my shoes, sighing heavily. "Charmaine, please don't start this tonight. Your brother is under a lot of pressure and he is building a legacy for this family." I turned my head slowly, staring at the woman who had raised me, and said softly, "He stole $120,000 from me, Mama. He committed identity theft." "Watch your mouth in my house," my father Carlton boomed, stepping out from his study and pointing a thick, calloused finger at me. "Nobody in this family is a thief. Your brother made a business decision. He needed backing, and you were sitting on a pile of cash doing absolutely nothing with it because you sit on a computer all day, always being selfish, hoarding your little pennies while Preston is out here taking real risks." The room tilted just a fraction, but enough to make my stomach hollow out as I repeated, my voice barely a whisper, "A business decision? He went into my old filing cabinet in your attic, the one I asked you to keep safe until I moved. He took my Social Security number, forged my signature, and wired my money to his wife's vanity project." Brittany let out a sharp, theatrical laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Vanity project? Honey, we are elevating the family name, something you clearly know nothing about, showing up here in your drab little slacks while we are trying to build generational wealth. So you should be thanking us for including your idle cash in our portfolio." I looked at my mother, searching her eyes for any trace of the woman who had taught me right from wrong, the woman who had dragged me to Sunday school every week preaching about integrity. But I found only a cold, defensive wall. "Evelyn," I said softly, pointedly stripping her of the title of mother, "did you give him the key to my cabinet?" My mother's jaw tightened, and she avoided my gaze, looking instead at a framed photograph of Preston on the mantel as she muttered, "He said he needed to verify some old tax records for a background check. He's my son, Charmaine. I'm not going to interrogate him like a criminal, and if you were more forthcoming with helping your family, he wouldn't have had to go around you." There it was, the ultimate gaslight, the victim-blaming masterpiece that had been the soundtrack of my entire adult life, confirming that if I had just set myself on fire faster, they wouldn't have had to steal my matches. For 2 decades, I had been the unbreakable foundation of this family, quietly paying the mortgage for 6 months so they wouldn't lose this very house when my father's auto shop went under, paying for the lawyer when Preston abandoned his pregnant girlfriend at 22, and gifting the catering budget when Brittany demanded a lavish wedding they couldn't afford. I was the fixer, the ATM, the silent, uncomplaining mule who was expected to pull the cart while everyone else rode in it. But as I took a deep, silent breath, the air in my lungs felt different, lighter and much colder. "I'm going to the police," I stated, not screaming, not crying, just delivering a simple, factual statement with the emotional detachment of reading a weather report. The silence that followed was absolute, the crackling of the fire suddenly sounding as loud as gunfire as Preston dropped his feet from the footrest, his smirk vanishing, and Brittany's glass freezing halfway to her mouth. My father's face flushed a deep, dangerous purple as he took 2 heavy steps toward me, growling, "You will do no such thing. You will not bring the police to my door, and you will not ruin your brother's life over some money he's already promised to pay back." "It is already ruined," I replied, my gaze locked on my father, "because he committed a federal crime. The only one ruining this family is you," my mother suddenly shrieked, her composed facade shattering as she stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You've always been jealous of him, jealous of his wife, jealous of his ambition. You are a bitter single woman who can't stand to see her own blood succeed. And if you dare call the police on my son, you are dead to me. Do you hear me? Dead?" I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, noting the deep lines around her mouth that I had helped pay to stress relieve with spa trips and luxury vacations, and I saw the absolute, terrifying sincerity in her eyes, realizing she would happily watch me burn if it meant keeping Preston warm. I slowly folded the bank statement, creasing it once, twice, running my thumb along the sharp edge of the paper before slipping it into the inside pocket of my blazer. "I want you out," my father said, his voice low, trembling with a rage I had only seen a handful of times in my life as he walked past me, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor, and yanked the heavy oak front door open. A brutal gust of December Chicago wind howled into the room, bringing with it a spray of freezing sleet, immediately plummeting the temperature in the living room as the storm outside raged with a level 3 blizzard warning. "Get out of my house," my father commanded, holding the door open against the howling wind. "And don't you ever come back until you are ready to apologize to your brother and act like a real family member." Preston leaned back in his chair, his smirk slowly returning, while Brittany took a victorious sip of her bourbon, and my mother crossed her arms, turning her back to me. They expected me to break, to fall to my knees, to cry, to beg for their love, and to negotiate my own boundaries just to stay in the warmth of their conditional acceptance, having spent my entire life conditioning me to believe that my worth was inextricably tied to my usefulness to them. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the woman standing in their living room, because I didn't shed a single tear, nor did I say a single word of protest. I calmly walked to the coat rack, pulled my heavy wool trench coat off the hanger, slipped my arms into the sleeves, buttoned it slowly and methodically from the bottom to the top, adjusted my scarf, and picked up my leather handbag. I walked toward the open door, the wind whipping my hair across my face and stinging my cheeks with ice crystals. And as I crossed the threshold, I paused without turning around. "Keep the money, Preston," I said softly, my voice just loud enough to carry over the wind before stepping out into the blinding white chaos of the blizzard. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind me with a violent, final thud, followed immediately by the sharp click of the deadbolt sliding into place, leaving me standing on the snow-covered porch in an absolute cold that bit through my slacks and chilled me to the bone. Yet, inside my chest, there was a strange, radiant heat, the heat of a forest fire that had just burned away decades of dead wood because they thought they had won, successfully bullying the quiet, reliable sister into submission one last time and forcing her to abandon her money out of sheer weakness. What Preston, Brittany, and my fiercely loyal parents did not know, and what they could not possibly comprehend in their shallow, status-obsessed minds, was the true legal nature of the account they had just drained. That money was not my personal savings, nor was it a house fund, despite what I had told my mother over dinner months ago to keep her from asking too many prying questions about my finances. I am a senior supply chain financial analyst for a Fortune 500 company, but in the shadows of my corporate 9-to-5, I am also the sole proprietor of a highly lucrative, independent logistics consulting firm structured as a limited liability company. The $120,000 Preston had wire transferred out of that specific, compartmentalized account was not my personal cash to be borrowed or gifted. It was the exact calculated sum of my corporate federal tax liability for the upcoming fiscal quarter. By stealing that money and moving it across state lines to fund a luxury yacht rental and a Beverly Hills real estate LLC, my brother had not just stolen from his sister in a civil dispute. He had embezzled corporate funds. He had committed interstate wire fraud, and most devastatingly of all, he had stolen directly from the United States Internal Revenue Service. I walked down the icy driveway, the snow crunching under my boots, unlocked my SUV, climbed inside, and started the engine, waiting as the heater slowly began to blow warm air over my frozen hands, while I looked back at the house where the lights glowed warmly, knowing they were probably pouring another round of drinks right now to celebrate my retreat. I pulled my phone from my purse, noted the time was exactly 10:14 p.m., and instead of calling the local police, who would only treat this as a petty family squabble and tell me to take him to small claims court, I pulled up the contact card for my corporate tax attorney and my forensic accountant. I drafted a single, perfectly punctuated email to both of them, stating that my corporate tax holding account had been compromised and drained via identity theft and wire fraud, and instructing them to prepare the necessary documentation for a formal FBI field office report first thing Monday morning, noting that I would provide the destination routing numbers shortly. I hit send, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the curb, my tires gripping the icy road as I refused to look in the rearview mirror, realizing that at 42 years old, for the first time in my entire existence, I was completely, terrifyingly, beautifully free. The storm raged around my car as I drove into the freezing night, but inside my mind, the waters were perfectly still. Preston wanted to build a legacy, Brittany wanted to play with the elite, and my parents wanted to sacrifice me on the altar of their golden child. So I was going to let them build their fragile glass castle as high as they wanted before I shattered it with the full, devastating weight of the federal government. The snow had stopped falling by the time dawn broke over downtown Chicago, leaving the city buried under a thick, blindingly white blanket of ice that mirrored the cold, absolute stillness inside my high-rise condo on the 34th floor. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, watching the miniature snowplows scrape along the tiny gray veins of the streets below, while my phone, resting on the granite kitchen island, remained completely dark and silent. There were no frantic missed calls from my mother asking if I had made it home safely in the treacherous blizzard. There were no half-hearted text messages from my father checking on my well-being. And there was certainly no apology from Preston, because in their minds, I was currently sitting in my apartment weeping, agonizing over my excommunication and frantically trying to draft an apology text that would win back their favor. That was the script we had followed for 42 years, the established choreography of our family dynamic, where the golden child acts recklessly, the scapegoat reacts with justified anger, the scapegoat is subsequently punished for reacting, and the scapegoat must ultimately purchase her way back into the family's good graces through financial sacrifice or silent submission. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, bitter heat ground me, realizing that I didn't feel the familiar, suffocating urge to draft an apology or beg for their conditional love. Instead, I felt like a hostage who had just realized the cell door had been unlocked the entire time, my mind razor-sharp and entirely devoid of panic. To truly understand how a mother can stand by and watch her grown son steal 6 figures from her daughter and then actively help him lock the door on her in a life-threatening blizzard, you have to understand the intricate, deeply ingrained anatomy of a golden child within certain family structures. Preston was born 2 years before me, but in the Gospel according to Carlton and Evelyn, he was the Immaculate Conception, the only son, the revered heir to a kingdom that consisted of nothing more than a struggling auto repair shop and a heavily mortgaged 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. I walked slowly over to the mahogany console table in my hallway, where a small gallery of framed photographs hung in perfectly aligned symmetry, and my eyes settled on one specific picture from my high school graduation, where I stood as valedictorian, holding my plaque and smiling tentatively at the camera. In that photograph, Preston, who was 19 at the time and already on severe academic probation at a mid-tier state college, stood dead center, completely obscuring half of my gown, while my mother looked exclusively at him with her hand resting proudly on his chest, and my father held the camera, perfectly encapsulating my role as nothing more than the background scenery in his life. When Preston failed out of college his sophomore year, my parents didn't yell, they didn't cut him off, and they didn't demand accountability. Instead, my father bought him a brand new Ford Mustang to supposedly encourage his entrepreneurial spirit, coddling his failure as if it were a delicate genius that the world simply didn't understand yet. Conversely, when I got accepted into Northwestern University with a partial scholarship, my mother didn't celebrate, but merely asked me how I planned to pay the remaining tuition, casually mentioning that they had just taken out a second mortgage on their home to fund Preston's premium sneaker boutique, a business venture that ultimately collapsed within 8 months. I didn't complain. I just worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and built my corporate career brick by bloody brick, swallowing the exhaustion, smiling through the exhausting microaggressions in corporate boardrooms, and pouring every extra dollar I earned into my independent logistics consulting firm until it became a quiet, unassailable fortress of wealth. But the more successful I became, the more my family subtly resented me for it, treating my stability as a walking insult to Preston's chronic mediocrity, and balancing their internal scales by slowly, methodically turning me into the family bank, levying what I now recognized as the strong black woman tax. The unspoken rule was simple. If I could afford a luxury condo overlooking the city, I could afford to pay my parents' property taxes without a thank you. If I could buy myself a reliable new car, I could easily afford to bail Preston out of his latest bad investment. My money wasn't seen as the hard-won fruit of my labor, but rather as community property that I was selfishly hoarding. Then came Brittany, stepping into our lives 4 years ago carrying a counterfeit designer bag and speaking with a vocabulary entirely constructed from reality television show catchphrases, bringing with her a toxic, desperate hunger for status that perfectly aligned with my brother's unearned arrogance. She wasn't wealthy, not even close, but she worshipped the aesthetic of wealth with a religious fervor, making her exactly the kind of woman Preston needed, someone who would look at his rented luxury cars and leased watches and treat him like a mogul, feeding his delusions of grandeur. More dangerously, Brittany recognized my parents' weakness immediately and weaponized it with terrifying efficiency, calling my mother the Queen and buying her cheap, flashy, cubic zirconia jewelry that my mother paraded around church as if it were from Harry Winston, while telling my father he was a powerful patriarch, stroking his ego until he practically purred in her presence. But with me, Brittany was entirely different because she possessed the cunning instinct of a scavenger, smelling the true power dynamic in the room and knowing instantly that I was the actual source of the capital that kept the family afloat. A reality she absolutely hated because it meant she wasn't the most important woman in the room. I walked back to the kitchen, setting my empty mug down next to my sleek silver laptop, opening the screen and letting the soft, clinical glow illuminate the quiet space as my mind drifted to a Sunday dinner just 6 months ago that perfectly crystallized her manipulation. I had spent 12 grueling hours negotiating a brutal international freight contract that Friday, slept through most of Saturday just to recover, and arrived at my parents' house on Sunday afternoon carrying 2 bottles of a very expensive, carefully selected Bordeaux as a gesture of goodwill. I'd barely taken my coat off when Brittany, who had strategically positioned herself at the head of the table, a seat my father usually strictly reserved for himself, swirled the expensive wine I had just poured for her and looked at me with eyes dripping with manufactured, weaponized concern. "You know, Charmaine," Brittany had said, her voice carrying across the silent dining room, "you work too hard. It's really aging you. And I have a friend who does excellent facial fillers, so I could probably get you a discount if you want to soften up those harsh lines." Preston had chuckled through a mouthful of food, ripping off a piece of bread and adding, "Leave her alone, Britt. Char likes being alone with her spreadsheets because not everyone is cut out for building a family legacy and a real empire like us." My mother had immediately chimed in from the kitchen, her voice sharp with judgment, agreeing that Preston was right and that I needed to soften up because men don't like a woman who is always so stiff, serious, and independent, telling me to look at Brittany because she knew how to cultivate a warm, inviting home for a man. I had looked at Brittany, who was currently living completely rent-free in my parents' basement while she and Preston supposedly saved for a house, drinking my $80 wine and wearing a silk blouse I had bought my mother for Christmas, which my mother had promptly and secretly regifted to her. I didn't yell. I didn't point out the glaring, pathetic hypocrisy of 2 grown adults living in a basement lecturing a self-made millionaire about legacy. I just took a sip of my ice water, maintained perfect posture, and said calmly that I was perfectly happy with my life, choosing peace over a screaming match. That was my fatal mistake, because to people like them, my quiet endurance wasn't seen as grace, it was seen as permission. They genuinely believed that because I didn't scream, I didn't bleed, and because I didn't aggressively demand respect, I simply didn't require it, mistaking my profound stoicism for boundless stupidity. A soft, sharp ping from my laptop suddenly interrupted my thoughts, echoing through the cavernous quiet of my condo and snapping my attention to the screen where a new email had just materialized in my encrypted inbox, marked with high importance. The sender was Arthur Vance, the senior partner at Vance and Associates Corporate Law, the ruthless, brilliant attorney who handled all of my corporate structuring, and the subject line read, "Re-urgent, unauthorized LLC fund transfer, wire fraud." I clicked open the message, my eyes scanning the crisp black text on the bright screen. "Good morning, Charmaine." The email began, "I have thoroughly reviewed the preliminary routing data you sent overnight and cross-referenced it with the bank's fraud department, and you are absolutely correct. The $120,000 was unlawfully transferred from your corporate tax holding account directly into a newly registered undercapitalized LLC named Preston and Britt Prestige Realty." The text continued, outlining the devastating legal reality. Because your independent consulting firm operates entirely under federal jurisdiction for interstate commerce, and the specific funds stolen were actively and legally earmarked for IRS corporate tax liabilities for the current fiscal quarter, this transfer crosses multiple severe legal thresholds and removes it entirely from the realm of a civil family dispute. Arthur's words were precise and clinical as he explained. This constitutes federal embezzlement and wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, carrying a potential penalty of up to 20 years in federal prison per count. And my forensic accountant is currently tracing the exact IP address used to initiate the transfer, which appears to match your parents' residential network. He concluded with a clear plan of action. Additionally, I am drafting the formal, comprehensive report for the FBI White Collar Crime Division, which we can submit by 9:00 a.m. Monday morning. Please advise how you wish to proceed, and let me know if I should immediately file the emergency injunction to freeze Preston and Britt Prestige Realty's accounts before the funds can be deployed. I stared at the screen, the soft blue light reflecting in my eyes, feeling a profound, terrifying calm wash over me as I considered the option to freeze the accounts, which was the logical, immediate textbook response to stop the bleeding and recover the funds before Brittany could sign the yacht charter or finalize the down payment on whatever Beverly Hills delusion she was currently chasing. But as I stood there in the quiet of my sanctuary, I realized that if I froze the accounts right now, Preston and Brittany would immediately pivot to playing the victims. My parents would inevitably mortgage their home yet again to hire him a high-priced defense attorney, and they would spin a narrative claiming it was all just a simple misunderstanding or a clerical mistake. Preston would put on a cheap suit, cry on the witness stand, and talk passionately about his entrepreneurial dreams, while Brittany would wipe away fake tears for the jury, and they would likely walk away with a slap on the wrist, a plea deal, and a lifetime of telling everyone in our extended family and church community how I jealously tried to destroy their success. No, I didn't just want my money back. I wanted the entire rotting illusion to burn to the ground. I wanted my parents to see exactly what kind of monsters they had traded their loyal daughter for. And I wanted Brittany to feel the exact freezing temperature of the snow I had been forced to stand in last night. I placed my hands on the keyboard, my fingers resting lightly on the keys, and typed my reply to Arthur with absolute, unwavering certainty. Arthur, do not file the injunction, do not freeze the accounts, and do not contact the bank to halt the pending transactions, I wrote, my keystrokes rhythmic and deliberate. I want you to let the wire transfer clear completely, let them spend the money, let them sign the binding lease for the luxury yacht, and let them confidently close escrow on the Beverly Hills property so they are legally and financially tethered to the stolen funds. I continued, outlining my strategy. Prepare the complete FBI dossier, ensuring every single piece of evidence is perfectly documented, but hold the official submission. I want the forensic trace to be absolute and undeniable, creating an airtight, incontrovertible paper trail showing that they knowingly, willingly, and repeatedly converted federal tax liabilities into personal luxury assets over a period of time. I finished the email with one final chilling directive. We will not warn them. We will not stop them. We will let them build their entire fraudulent empire on my stolen money, and we will drop the federal hammer only when they have achieved maximum exposure and have absolutely no way to claim ignorance or back out. I hit send, watching the email vanish into the ether, then closed the laptop with a soft, decisive click and walked back over to the expansive window, watching the city below begin to wake up and move through the ice. For 20 years, I had been my family's tireless shield, absorbing their debts, their catastrophic mistakes, their casual cruelties, and their endless failures, all while silently smiling and serving them Sunday dinner, because I believed that was what a good daughter was supposed to do. They had finally, forcefully taken that shield from my hands, casting me out into the cold because they believed I was too weak to ever fight back. completely failing to realize that without my shield protecting them, they were now completely, devastatingly exposed to my sword. The sleek black town car pulled up to the curb outside the towering glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of downtown Chicago's financial district precisely at 7:30 on Monday morning, the heavy doors opening to the bitter, lingering cold of the aftermath of the blizzard as I stepped onto the pristine, salted pavement. My stiletto heels clicked with sharp, rhythmic authority against the polished Italian marble of the expansive lobby, a sound that commanded immediate, unspoken respect from the security personnel who offered polite nods and warm greetings, a stark, almost dizzying contrast to the absolute degradation I had been subjected to in my parents' living room just 48 hours prior. I rode the private executive elevator up to the 42nd floor in absolute silence, watching the digital numbers ascend and feeling a profound sense of compartmentalization taking hold of my mind, locking away the bleeding, rejected daughter and awakening the cold, meticulous architect of my own sovereign defense. When I stepped into my expansive corner office with its panoramic, unobstructed views of the freezing, steel-gray expanse of Lake Michigan, my assistant, a sharply dressed young woman named Claire, immediately handed me a steaming cup of my preferred single-origin espresso and a perfectly organized dossier containing the morning's supply chain analytics, blissfully unaware that her boss was currently orchestrating the legal annihilation of her own bloodline. I thanked her softly, closed the heavy oak door behind me, and engaged the electronic privacy lock, instantly transforming the room into an impenetrable fortress of corporate strategy before walking over to my massive mahogany desk and waking up my encrypted workstation. Precisely at 8 o'clock, the secure video conferencing software chimed, and the screen populated with two distinct feeds. On the left was Arthur Vance, my silver-haired, ruthlessly brilliant corporate attorney sitting in his oak-paneled office, and on the right was Elias Thorne, my forensic accountant, a man whose mild-mannered appearance completely masked his predatory genius for tracking hidden digital assets. "Good morning, Charmaine," Arthur began, his voice gravelly and devoid of any unnecessary pleasantries, his eyes fixed on whatever documents he was reviewing off-screen before he adjusted his glasses and leaned into the camera. "Elias has spent the weekend pulling the thread on this unauthorized wire transfer, and the level of sheer, unadulterated stupidity your brother has displayed is frankly staggering, even for an amateur criminal." Elias cleared his throat, sharing his screen to display a highly complex, color-coded flowchart that mapped out the exact, undeniable trajectory of my stolen $120,000, tracing it from my secure corporate holding account at Chase Bank to its final, fraudulent destinations. "Charmaine, your brother didn't just walk into a bank and ask for a withdrawal," Elias explained, his cursor hovering over a red node on the flowchart as he began to break down the mechanics of the digital heist with clinical precision. He utilized a remarkably poorly forged power of attorney document, which we have already subpoenaed a digital copy of, and the notary's stamp on it is completely fraudulent, likely purchased from an unregulated online vendor, which adds a count of federal forgery to the growing list of charges. Elias clicked to the next slide, showing a string of IP addresses and digital timestamps that definitively proved the crime wasn't a sudden crime of passion, but a premeditated act of financial sabotage. He executed the wire transfer using a residential Comcast IP address that is directly registered to your father, Carlton, meaning he sat in your parents' house, logged onto their Wi-Fi network, and deliberately impersonated a corporate officer to initiate an interstate wire transfer. I took a slow sip of my espresso, my face remaining perfectly impassive, feeling absolutely no surprise that my brother had committed a federal felony from the very same house where my parents had subsequently kicked me out into a blizzard for daring to question his integrity. "Walk me through the disbursement, Elias," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the heavy, lingering grief that occasionally threatened to bloom in my chest. Where exactly did the corporate tax liability end up? Elias typed a quick command, and the flowchart expanded to reveal two distinct, newly funded accounts under the umbrella of Preston and Britt Prestige Realty LLC, an entity that had been hastily registered in the state of Delaware just 3 weeks prior, but was operating exclusively out of California. The initial $120,000 hit the IG LLC's primary operating account on Friday afternoon, and they wasted absolutely no time liquidating it, Elias detailed, his tone reflecting a professional disgust at the reckless spending. Exactly $40,000 was immediately wired to a luxury concierge service in Miami called Oceanic Lux Charters to secure a non-refundable deposit and operating fee for a 90-foot yacht rental for this upcoming weekend. I envisioned Brittany sitting in my parents' basement, scrolling through Instagram on her phone, desperately coveting the artificial lives of influencers, and deciding that stealing my corporate tax money was a perfectly reasonable way to fund her pathetic illusion of grandeur. And the remaining $80,000? I asked, already knowing the answer would be tied to the supposed real estate empire Preston was constantly bragging about to my father. The remaining $80,000 was wired directly into an escrow account held by a prominent Beverly Hills title company, Elias confirmed, bringing up a copy of the pending wire receipt. It serves as the earnest money and initial down payment for a short-term lease-to-own contract on a $6 million property in the Hollywood Hills, a contract they have absolutely no verifiable income to support, meaning they are attempting to use your stolen tax funds to fraudulently secure a high-end property lease to use as a backdrop for their new luxury real estate branding. Arthur leaned forward on his feed, steepling his fingers, his expression shifting into the grim, serious demeanor of a lawyer preparing for a federal prosecution. Charmaine, I need you to understand the absolute gravity of this situation, because once we cross this threshold, there is no pulling back, no settling out of court, and no familial reconciliation, Arthur warned, his voice low and commanding. Because your consulting firm is a registered LLC that engages in interstate commerce, and because these specific funds were meticulously earmarked and documented as federal corporate tax liabilities for the IRS, this is not a civil matter where you can just sue him for restitution. He paused, letting the weight of the law settle into the silence of my office. This is a violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. Federal wire fraud, combined with aggravated identity theft, and because he intercepted tax funds, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division will inevitably be brought into the fold, and the federal government does not have a sense of humor about their money being used to rent yachts. Arthur looked directly into the camera, his gaze piercing. If I file this comprehensive dossier with the FBI White-Collar Crime Division, your brother will face a federal indictment, and given the dollar amount and the clear, undeniable paper trail he left, he will face mandatory minimum sentencing. He will go to federal prison. Charmaine and his wife, as a co-signer and beneficiary of the LLC, will likely be indicted as a co-conspirator. The silence in my office was absolute, save for the faint rhythmic hum of the HVAC system, as I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, staring at the screen and absorbing the magnitude of the power I now held in my hands. I thought about my mother standing in the kitchen archway telling me that Preston was building a legacy and that I was just a bitter, selfish woman hoarding my pennies. I thought about my father, a man who demanded respect but offered none, threatening me and physically throwing me out into a life-threatening storm to protect a thief. And I thought about Preston and Brittany, two deeply mediocre, profoundly entitled parasites who genuinely believed they could slaughter the golden goose and simply move into its nest. They had spent my entire life teaching me that I was disposable, that my sole purpose was to act as the reinforced concrete foundation upon which they could build their fragile, delusional castles in the sky, and they had never once considered what would happen if the foundation simply decided to stop holding them up. "Arthur," I said, my voice resonating with a quiet, terrifying sovereignty that I had never fully embraced until this exact moment. I'm perfectly aware of the consequences, and I have absolutely zero intention of pulling anything back. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool mahogany desk. But we are not filing it today, because if we file it today, the bank might flag the escrow transfer before it finalizes, and the yacht charter company might cancel the reservation before they step foot on the boat. Arthur raised an eyebrow, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth as he began to realize the true depth of my strategy. "You want them to execute the contracts," Arthur stated. Not a question, but a confirmation of the legal trap I was setting. "Exactly," I replied, my eyes locked on his. "I want the Beverly Hills escrow to close. I want them to sign the final, binding lease documents, and I want them to physically board that yacht and take all the photographs they want, because I want them to be inextricably, legally tethered to the stolen funds, leaving them absolutely no room to claim it was a banking error or a temporary holding transfer." I instructed Elias to continue monitoring the IP addresses and to capture every single digital signature, email confirmation, and social media post that connected Brittany and Preston to the expenditures, ensuring the FBI would receive a neatly wrapped, irrefutable package of evidence that required zero investigative effort on their part. After the video call ended, I remained seated at my desk for a long moment, staring out at the frozen lake before I picked up my personal phone and opened an anonymous secondary Instagram account I had created years ago, specifically to monitor the family events I was routinely excluded from. I navigated to Brittany's public profile, and there it was, posted just 2 hours ago, a professionally edited photograph of her and Preston standing on the deck of a massive, gleaming white yacht docked in Miami, the morning sun catching the expensive champagne flutes in their hands. The caption was a masterclass in delusional narcissism. "God rewards the faithful and the hard-working. While others hate, we elevate." Huge things coming for Preston and Britt Prestige Realty, #self-made, empire building, Beverly Hills bound, blessed. I stared at the photograph, analyzing the smug, victorious grin on my brother's face, the man who had quite literally stolen from the federal government using his sister's identity and was now publicly branding himself as a self-made mogul, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actively documenting his own federal indictment in real time for the entire world to see. A sudden sharp vibration in my hand pulled my attention away from the screen. A text message had just come through on my private line, and the name flashing on the screen was Evelyn, Mother. I stared at the name for a long time, feeling a cold, heavy stone settle in the pit of my stomach, knowing that this message was not going to be an apology, not a desperate plea for forgiveness, but merely a continuation of the same toxic, manipulative cycle they had always used to bring me back into compliance. I tapped the screen and opened the message, reading the words that would ultimately extinguish the very last microscopic ember of familial loyalty I held in my heart. "Your father and I hope you have calmed down from your little tantrum on Friday night," the text read, her tone dripping with the kind of passive-aggressive authority that demanded immediate submission. "Preston and Brittany are officially closing on their new property in California this week, and they are hosting a huge VIP housewarming party next Saturday night. We are flying out, and if you are ready to formally apologize to your brother for your accusations and act like a supportive sister, you are allowed to attend. But you need to pay for your own flight and bring a substantial housewarming gift to make amends. Let me know by tomorrow so I can tell Brittany to add you to the guest list, and don't make this harder than it has to be." I read the message twice, marveling at the breathtaking, almost clinical level of delusion required to steal $120,000 from someone, throw them out into a blizzard, and then demand a formal apology and a housewarming gift to celebrate the purchase made with the stolen funds. They truly believed I was entirely powerless, an obedient broken workhorse who would eventually trudge back to the barn, head bowed, ready to accept whatever scraps of affection they deigned to throw on the floor. I didn't reply. I didn't type out a furious paragraph, and I didn't block her number. Instead, I simply took a screenshot of the text message, forwarded it to my secure, encrypted evidentiary file labeled FBI dossier addendums, and calmly placed my phone face down on the desk. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the golden children were happily dancing on a trap door that I was going to pull the exact moment they demanded the world look at them. I picked up my pen, pulled the supply chain analytics dossier toward me, and went back to work, operating with the cold, devastating grace of a matriarch who had finally learned how to build an empire out of the ashes of her own family. The rest of the week unfolded with a surreal, hyper-focused clarity, the kind of absolute psychological detachment that only comes when you have finally accepted that the people you loved most in the world are nothing more than active threats to your survival. Tuesday morning arrived with another brutal Chicago freeze, but inside my office, I was running two entirely different empires simultaneously, seamlessly switching between approving multi-million-dollar international shipping manifests for my corporate employer and meticulously cataloging every single piece of digital evidence my brother and sister-in-law were arrogant enough to broadcast to the public. Brittany had apparently decided that the stolen $120,000 was the exact catalyst she needed to launch her career as a luxury lifestyle influencer, because by Wednesday afternoon, her previously stagnant Instagram account was flooded with high-definition, professionally edited content that practically screamed federal wire fraud. I sat at my mahogany desk, eating a quiet salad for lunch, watching a live stream she had broadcasted from the deck of the 90-foot yacht in Miami they had rented with my tax funds, her voice carrying that manufactured, breathless excitement as she gave a tour of the master cabin, popping a bottle of Dom Perignon while Preston lounged in the background wearing a linen suit that he undoubtedly couldn't afford to dry clean. We just believe that if you claim it, the universe provides it, Brittany told her 300 viewers, holding the champagne flute up to the camera with a perfectly manicured hand, the diamond tennis bracelet catching the Miami sun. Preston has been working so incredibly hard on the back end of Prestige Realty, and we are just so blessed to finally see the fruits of our labor manifesting. Because generational wealth doesn't build itself, you have to have the courage to step out on faith and make the big investments. I watched the screen, my expression perfectly flat, marveling at the breathtaking cognitive dissonance required to steal a six-figure sum from your sister, forge federal documents, and then publicly attribute the resulting luxury vacation to God's favor and your husband's non-existent work ethic. It was a fascinating clinical study in narcissistic delusion, but more importantly, it was the exact rope they needed to hang themselves. Because every single post, every geotag, and every live stream was being instantly archived, time-stamped, and cross-referenced by Elias Thorne, my forensic accountant, who was building a dossier so airtight that a first-year law student could successfully prosecute the case. On Thursday morning, Elias requested another secure video conference, his face appearing on my monitor looking slightly more grim than usual, a thick digital file open on his shared screen. "Charmaine, they didn't just stop at the yacht and the initial Beverly Hills down payment," Elias began, adjusting his glasses and pulling up a new, highly complex financial flow chart that mapped out a web of secondary transactions. I dug deeper into the escrow account holding the $80,000 in California, and Preston isn't just leasing that Hollywood Hills property. He used your stolen funds as the cash collateral to secure a highly predatory, short-term balloon mortgage through a shadow lender that caters exclusively to high-risk borrowers who want to project wealth. Elias explained that Preston had essentially bought into a financial suicide pact, using the stolen money to cover the exorbitant closing costs in the first 3 months of mortgage payments on a $6 million mansion, completely banking on the delusional idea that he would somehow flip the property or secure massive investor funding before the brutal balloon payment came due in 90 days. But that wasn't the most damning piece of information Elias had uncovered. He clicked to the next slide, displaying a rejected application form from a major commercial bank. Preston got greedy, Elias stated, his voice laced with professional disgust. Once he realized how easily he had transferred the initial $120,000 using the forged power of attorney, he tried to go back to the well, attempting to use your LLC's employer identification number, your EIN, to apply for a $500,000 commercial line of credit under the name of Prestige Realty. I felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream, my fingers tightening slightly around my expensive Mont Blanc pen, because trying to steal cash was one thing, but attempting to completely leverage my corporate entity's spotless credit history to fund a $500,000 phantom empire was an act of financial terrorism that could have legitimately destroyed my entire consulting business. Did the application go through? I asked, my voice remaining level, though the temperature in my office seemed to drop several degrees. No, Elias assured me quickly, bringing up the denial letter. Your secondary authentication protocols blocked it immediately, and the bank flagged the application for identity verification, which Preston obviously couldn't provide, so the application was automatically denied and locked out. I exhaled a slow, controlled breath, the tension leaving my shoulders as Elias continued. However, the attempt itself is a massive, glowing federal footprint because it elevates the charges from simple wire fraud to attempted corporate identity theft and bank fraud on a massive scale, meaning that when the FBI finally kicks their door in, they won't just be looking at a few years of restitution, they will be looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the digital paper trail that spelled out the absolute, undeniable destruction of my brother's life. And for a fleeting, microscopic fraction of a second, the ghost of the obedient, sacrificial daughter I used to be whispered in my ear, wondering if this was too harsh, wondering if I should just freeze the accounts, take the loss, and walk away to keep the peace. But then I remembered the blinding, freezing wind of the blizzard on my face. I remembered my father physically shoving me out the door to protect a thief, and I remembered my mother looking at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, calling me a bitter, jealous woman, simply because I refused to be their sacrificial lamb anymore. In the Black community, there is a toxic, pervasive expectation placed upon successful women to act as the eternal shock absorbers for the catastrophic failures of the men in their families, a cultural demand that we shrink ourselves, diminish our accomplishments, and empty our bank accounts so that men like Preston can walk around wearing the unearned armor of a patriarch. We are taught to camouflage our bleeding hearts behind flawless grace and pressed suits, expected to continuously show up, cook the Sunday dinners, protect the family secrets, and hold the line, all while watching the people we birthed and built treat us as nothing more than an automated safety net, completely invisible as human beings until the exact moment our wallets snap shut. I was done shrinking. I was done acting as the financial scaffolding for a family that would gleefully watch me burn if it kept them warm for a single night. Document the attempted bank fraud, Elias, I commanded, my voice devoid of any hesitation or mercy. Add it to the FBI dossier, but do not trigger any alerts that would tip him off. I want him to feel completely, utterly invincible right up until the exact second the handcuffs click around his wrists. Elias nodded, making a note on his digital pad, but he didn't end the call. Instead, he hesitated, a rare look of unease crossing his mild-mannered features, before he pulled up a completely different set of documents that were not related to the Beverly Hills property or the yacht. There is one more thing, Charmaine, something I stumbled across while I was running the background asset checks on Preston's previous financial history, specifically regarding the failed premium sneaker boutique your parents helped him fund years ago. My eyes narrowed, my posture stiffening slightly. My parents took out a second mortgage on their home to fund that business. I remember because my mother used it as an excuse to refuse to help me with my college tuition. Elias nodded slowly. That is what they told you, and that is what they may genuinely believe. But that is not entirely accurate. He pulled up a complex property deed and a series of loan origination documents. Your parents didn't take out a traditional second mortgage from a reputable bank. Preston brokered the deal himself through a highly predatory subprime private equity firm based out of Nevada, convincing your father to sign over the equity of their home as collateral for a high-yield, variable interest business loan. I stared at the screen, the horrific reality of what Elias was saying slowly locking into place in my mind. My father, a man who prided himself on his supposed financial dominance and patriarchal authority, had been manipulated by his own son into signing a financial death warrant for the house I grew up in. The sneaker boutique failed, obviously, Elias continued, his cursor highlighting the payment history. And Preston has been quietly, desperately paying the absolute minimum interest on this subprime loan for the last 8 years to keep the equity firm from foreclosing on your parents' house, essentially running a slow-motion Ponzi scheme where he borrows from Peter to pay Paul just to keep your parents completely oblivious to the fact that they don't actually own their home anymore. The sheer, breathtaking magnitude of Preston's deception hit me like a physical blow, completely recontextualizing the entire dynamic of my family. My parents worshipped Preston because they believed he was a struggling but brilliant entrepreneur, when in reality, he was a desperate, drowning fraud who had secretly leveraged their entire retirement and housing security to fund his delusions, leaving them entirely at the mercy of a predatory private equity firm. "What is the current status of the loan, Elias?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet, my mind already calculating the exact trajectory of this new, devastating weapon. "That is the interesting part," Elias said, pulling up a recent internal memo he had legally acquired through his network. "Because Preston diverted his available cash to steal your money and fund the Beverly Hills illusion, he missed the last 2 payments on the subprime loan attached to your parents' house, and the private equity firm in Nevada is aggressively looking to offload their toxic assets. They are currently packaging this specific debt, along with several others, to be sold off to third-party collection agencies or aggressive real estate acquisition firms at a steep discount just to clear their books." The silence in my office was absolute as I stared at the documents on the screen. A brilliant, terrifyingly cold plan beginning to form in the architecture of my mind, a plan so ruthlessly complete that it would not only punish the theft of my corporate funds, but absolutely annihilate the false hierarchy of my entire family structure. Through my consulting firm, I had established a highly aggressive, completely anonymous shadow venture capital LLC in Delaware, specifically designed to legally acquire distressed commercial assets and aggressively restructure them, an entity completely untraceable to Charmaine the daughter or Charmaine the sister. "Elias," I said, my voice resonating with a quiet, lethal authority that made the forensic accountant sit up perfectly straight on the video feed. "I want you to immediately contact my shadow VC firm, authorize the release of the necessary capital, and reach out to that private equity firm in Nevada through our blind corporate proxies." I paused, letting my eyes trace the signature of my father on the disastrous loan documents, the very same man who had thrown me out into a blizzard for supposedly ruining his son's legacy. I want to buy the debt. I want to buy the loan, the lien, and the entire legal right to foreclose on my parents' house, and I want it expedited and finalized before Brittany's housewarming party in Beverly Hills next Saturday. Elias's eyes widened slightly as the full, devastating scope of my strategy dawned on him, realizing that I was not just going to send my brother to federal prison, but I was going to legally, systematically, and ruthlessly dismantle the very roof over my parents' heads, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing reality of the son they had chosen over me. There is a distinct, intoxicating purity to the mechanics of absolute financial destruction when executed with the cold, sterile precision of corporate law, an elegant brutality that requires no screaming, no shattered glass, and no theatrical displays of emotion, only the quiet, rhythmic clicking of a keyboard and the seamless transfer of digital assets across state lines. By Friday morning, the freezing Chicago wind had finally broken, leaving the city bathed in a deceptive, blindingly bright winter sunlight that poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, illuminating the heavy, silver heirloom ring on my right hand as my fingers rested perfectly still upon my mahogany desk. I was currently looking at a highly classified, heavily encrypted virtual data room hosted by my attorney, Arthur Vance, watching the architecture of my family's ruin load onto the screen piece by undeniable piece as the wheels of my shadow venture capital firm, Obsidian Holdings, LLC, began to turn with devastating efficiency. When I established Obsidian Holdings 4 years ago in the corporate haven of Delaware, utilizing layers of blind trusts and proxy directors to ensure absolute anonymity, my original intent was merely to protect my accumulated wealth from the parasitic, never-ending demands of my family, creating a financial fortress where I could safely invest in distressed commercial logistics hubs without my brother Preston constantly begging for a piece of the pie. I never could have imagined that this very same invisible corporate leviathan would become the exact instrument I would use to legally conquer the very ground my parents walked on. But as the old saying goes, the universe has a profoundly ironic sense of humor when dealing with the arrogant. The Nevada-based private equity firm that held the predatory subprime mortgage on my parents' house was called Apex Financial Solutions, a parasitic institution that specialized in identifying desperate, financially illiterate individuals like my brother, offering them high-interest capital backed by the equity of their elderly parents' homes, and then aggressively foreclosing the moment a payment was missed. According to the intelligence gathered by my forensic accountant, Elias Thorne, Apex Financial was currently experiencing a massive internal liquidity crisis and was desperately attempting to liquidate their portfolio of toxic, underperforming residential debt before the end of the fiscal quarter, aggressively shopping a bundled package of defaulted promissory notes to aggressive collection agencies for pennies on the dollar. They wanted cash immediately, and they wanted these toxic assets off their books before the federal regulators initiated their annual audits, which presented me with a breathtakingly perfect, terrifyingly legal window of opportunity. I didn't reach out to Apex Financial myself, nor did Arthur Vance, because any connection to my name or my primary legal counsel would have immediately triggered red flags and potentially alerted Preston to the impending disaster. Instead, we utilized a ruthless, highly specialized proxy acquisitions manager named Sterling, a man whose entire career was built on quietly orchestrating hostile takeovers and shadow buyouts, without ever revealing the true identity of his sovereign clients. Sterling approached Apex Financial on Thursday afternoon representing Obsidian Holdings, presenting a clean, aggressive, all-cash offer to completely buy out the specific tranche of debt that contained my parents' mortgage, demanding an expedited transfer of the deed of trust, the original promissory note signed by my father, and the absolute unrestricted right to accelerate the loan and initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. Because Preston had already missed 2 consecutive balloon payments while busy funneling my stolen tax money into his fraudulent Beverly Hills lifestyle, the loan was officially classified as in severe default, meaning Apex Financial was absolutely thrilled to offload the headache to Obsidian Holdings, happily agreeing to a massive discount just to wash their hands of the impending legal nightmare. As I sat in my office watching the digital paperwork finalize on my encrypted monitor, I felt a strange, profound sense of historical vindication wash over me, a deep, ancestral settling of the scales. For decades, I had sat in the kitchen of that house, a kitchen permanently infused with the comforting sense of Sunday cornbread and slow-cooked collard greens, silently scrubbing the countertops and quietly paying the utility bills, while my mother praised Preston for simply walking into the room, and my father sat in his leather recliner, a recliner I had purchased with my first corporate bonus, dictating the rules of his castle and demanding absolute subservience from the daughter who was secretly subsidizing his kingdom. They had kicked me out of that house into a life-threatening blizzard, locking the heavy oak door behind me with a violent, terrifying finality, genuinely believing they were banishing me from their sanctuary, completely oblivious to the fact that their golden child had long ago traded the keys to the castle for a handful of magic beans. I watched the progress bar on my screen reach 100%, and a sharp, satisfying ping echoed through my office as the final PDF materialized, displaying the legally binding assignment of mortgage document, stamped and verified, confirming that Obsidian Holdings, LLC, and by direct unassailable extension, me, was now the sole, undisputed owner of my parents' home. I didn't just hold the mortgage because the loan was already in critical default. I held the absolute legal right to demand the full, immediate repayment of the entire principal balance within 30 days. And when they inevitably failed to produce the hundreds of thousands of dollars Preston had squandered, I had the right to seize the property, evict the occupants, and auction the house off to the highest bidder without a single shred of mercy. The sheer, overwhelming power of holding my parents' literal shelter in the palm of my hand was intoxicating. But my strategic encirclement was not yet complete, because Elias Thorne had uncovered one more devastating vulnerability in my brother's carefully constructed illusion of success. Preston loved to brag to our extended family and my parents' church congregation about his bustling, high-end commercial office space downtown, a place he claimed was the central nervous system of prestige realty. But Elias's deep dive into the public records revealed that Preston's headquarters was nothing more than a poorly maintained, overpriced suite in a decaying strip mall on the outskirts of the city. And just like his parents' mortgage, Preston had completely stopped paying the rent on the commercial lease 3 months ago. The landlord of the commercial building, an exhausted, semi-retired property developer, had already filed the preliminary paperwork for a commercial eviction, desperate to get Preston out of the unit so he could lease it to a reliable tenant. But the legal backlog in the county courts meant the eviction process was moving at a glacial pace, allowing Preston to continue using the office as a fraudulent backdrop for his social media posts. I instructed Sterling to contact the commercial landlord directly, operating once again under the impenetrable shield of Obsidian Holdings, and offered to purchase the specific commercial unit outright, assuming all the legal rights of the landlord, including the existing lease agreement and the active eviction proceedings against Preston and Britt Prestige Realty. The landlord, eager for a massive cash injection and thrilled to be rid of a deadbeat tenant, accepted the offer within 3 hours, signing over the deed to the commercial space and transferring the full legal authority of the eviction to my shadow firm. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet office, tracing the rim of my espresso cup with a manicured fingernail as I surveyed the completely invisible, perfectly constructed legal prison I had just built around my entire family in less than 5 days. Preston was currently sailing on a rented 90-foot yacht in Miami, drinking expensive champagne paid for with my stolen corporate tax funds, posting delusional, inspirational quotes about building generational wealth, while in reality, he was an unemployed, broke fraud who was about to be federally indicted for wire fraud and embezzlement. His commercial office space was now legally owned by his sister, who was actively processing his eviction. And the childhood home he had secretly leveraged to the brink of ruin was now fully controlled by the very same sister he had thrown out into the snow. My parents were currently packing their bags, preparing to fly first class, likely on credit cards they couldn't afford to pay off, to California to attend a lavish fake housewarming party for a Beverly Hills mansion their son was fraudulently leasing with stolen money, completely unaware that the bed they were sleeping in, the roof over their heads, and the very floorboards beneath their feet no longer belonged to them. They had built their entire identities around the toxic, deeply flawed premise that they were the unbreakable, sovereign patriarch and matriarch of a successful family, viewing my quiet, consistent financial support not as a lifeline, but as a mandatory tribute owed to them for the simple act of bringing me into the world, a transactional love that only existed as long as I continued to write the checks and swallow their disrespect. For years, I had internalized the specific, agonizing loneliness of the matriarch, the profound isolation that comes from realizing that if you stop holding the rope, everyone will immediately complain about the rope dropping. But absolutely no one will ever ask if your hands are blistered and bleeding from the friction. Well, I had finally let go of the rope, and instead of letting it fall to the ground, I had quietly, elegantly tied it into a federal noose, and I was going to let them place it entirely around their own necks. A soft, blinking light on my desk phone suddenly broke through my thoughts, indicating an incoming call on my private, unlisted mobile line, a number I only gave to high-level corporate clients and immediate family members. I picked up the sleek black device, glancing at the caller ID, and a cold, razor-thin smile touched the corners of my mouth as I saw the name illuminating the screen. Preston. It was fascinating. Less than a week ago, he had sat in a leather recliner and smugly justified stealing my future, mocking my single status and my lack of a husband. And now, he was calling me, undoubtedly operating under the delusion that enough time had passed for my tantrum to subside and that I was ready to resume my role as the compliant, forgiving sister. He probably needed a favor, perhaps a small loan, to cover the exorbitant catering costs for the Beverly Hills housewarming party that his stolen funds couldn't quite stretch to cover. Or maybe he was calling to formally, graciously invite me to the party, provided I brought an expensive gift to apologize for my previous outburst. I let the phone ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, slipping flawlessly biological warfare for decades, knowing that the key to this final act was absolute, chilling composure. I swiped the screen, answering the call, and raised the phone to my ear, remaining perfectly silent, waiting for the golden child to speak, my finger gently resting on the record button to ensure every single transactional, manipulative word he was about to say would be captured, categorized, and added to the rapidly expanding federal dossier that would soon erase his entire existence from the map of the free world. I swiped the screen of my sleek black phone to answer the call, pressing the device to my ear, while my right index finger simultaneously engaged the recording application, perfectly capturing the exact moment my brother's voice broke the absolute pristine silence of my corporate office with a forced booming joviality that immediately made my skin crawl. "Char, hey, it's Preston," he began, the line crackling slightly with the unmistakable background noise of seagulls and the rhythmic splashing of ocean waves against a fiberglass hull, confirming that he was indeed calling me from the deck of the 90-foot yacht he had fraudulently rented with my stolen corporate tax funds. I remained perfectly silent, utilizing the devastating power of the quiet, unyielding gaze, translated into a heavy, suffocating silence over the phone, a technique I had mastered in countless brutal corporate boardrooms, forcing the other person to fill the uncomfortable void with their own nervous insecurities. "Look, I know things got a little heated at Mom and Dad's house last weekend," Preston continued, his voice dropping an octave in a pathetic attempt to sound authoritative and mature, casually minimizing the act of committing federal wire fraud and identity theft into a minor sibling squabble that simply got heated over Sunday dinner. "But we are family, and family occasionally bumps heads when big business moves are being made. So I'm calling to be the bigger person and extend an olive branch, because Brittany and I are flying back to Los Angeles tomorrow to finalize the paperwork on the Beverly Hills property, and we really want you to be at the VIP housewarming party on Saturday." I listened to his words, marveling at the breathtaking audacity required to steal $120,000, lock your sister out in a life-threatening blizzard, and then magnanimously offer to be the bigger person by inviting her to a party funded entirely by her own stolen money. "Is that so, Preston?" I replied, my voice completely devoid of any recognizable emotion, as smooth and cold as the frozen surface of Lake Michigan, 34 floors below me. "Yeah, absolutely," he said, his tone brightening, clearly mistaking my restrained composure for meek compliance, genuinely believing that the week of silence had broken my spirit and forced me back into my designated role as the obedient, forgiving family workhorse. "But listen, Char, since we had to tie up all of our immediate liquidity in the escrow accounts and the yacht charter to secure our networking platforms, the event budget for Saturday is a little tighter than we anticipated, and Brittany has invited some heavy hitters from the LA real estate scene, people we really need to impress." There it was, the inevitable, predictable pivot, the transactional illusion that defined every single interaction I ever had with my family, the absolute certainty that they never reached out to me out of genuine love or concern, but only when they needed me to subsidize their delusions. "We need to cover the premium catering, the private chef, and the valet security for the evening," Preston explained smoothly, the grift rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "It's going to run about $15,000, and since you acted so out of pocket last week and disrespected Dad in his own house, we thought this would be the perfect opportunity for you to step up, cover the catering as your housewarming gift to us, and smooth everything over with the family." I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the heavy gold heirloom ring on my finger press into my skin, anchoring me to the reality that this man, who was currently facing decades in a federal penitentiary and who no longer even legally owned the commercial office he claimed as his headquarters, was actively trying to extort another $15,000 from me under the guise of family loyalty. He wanted me to pay for the privilege of watching him parade around in a stolen life, to purchase my re-entry into a family that viewed me strictly as an appliance, to be plugged in when they needed power, and unplugged and thrown in a closet when they didn't. "If you wire the $15,000 to the Prestige Realty account by tomorrow morning, I'll make sure Dad knows you're making amends. And Brittany will even put you on the VIP guest list so you can mingle with some real high-net-worth individuals," Preston added, his voice dripping with condescension, as if he were granting me access to a royal court rather than a crime scene. "Hold on, Preston," a different voice suddenly echoed through the phone, slightly muffled as the device was passed to someone else, and then my mother's voice filled my ear, sharp, pious, and laced with absolute entitlement. "Charmaine, I hope you are listening to your brother and realizing what a blessing it is that he is willing to forgive your jealous outburst last weekend. God blesses those who support their family, and your father and I are expecting you to do the right thing and help your brother establish his legacy in California." Hearing Evelyn's voice, the woman who gave birth to me casually demanding that I continue to fund the parasite who had stolen my corporate tax money, solidified the final impenetrable layer of ice around my heart, completely severing the last microscopic thread of maternal loyalty I possessed. She was sitting in a house in Chicago that I now legally owned through a shadow venture capital firm, a house that was on the brink of foreclosure due to her golden son's secret financial sabotage, and she was lecturing me about legacy while entirely blind to the fact that she was currently speaking to her landlord, her executioner, and the architect of her impending absolute ruin. "You want me to handle the arrangements for Saturday night," I stated slowly, my voice resonating with a quiet, lethal double meaning that sailed completely over their arrogant heads. "Yes, exactly. Just wire the $15,000 and we will take care of the rest," Preston chimed back in, clearly hovering right next to the phone, practically vibrating with the anticipation of securing another payday from his endless well of a sister. "You don't need to worry about the catering budget, Preston," I replied, my tone perfectly even, meticulously choosing words that were entirely truthful but completely deceptive in their intent. "I will personally ensure that everything you deserve is delivered directly to the housewarming party on Saturday night, and I will be there in person to watch you receive it." I could practically hear the smug, victorious smiles forming on their faces, completely misinterpreting my lethal promise of federal retribution as a pathetic surrender to their extortion, genuinely believing that they had successfully bullied the strong black woman back into her designated corner of silent financial servitude. "That's my girl," Preston laughed, a sickeningly patronizing sound that made my jaw clench behind my composed expression. "I knew you'd come to your senses, Char, so just wear something nice. Try not to look so stiff, and we'll see you in Beverly Hills." He ended the call without waiting for a goodbye, the line going dead in my ear, and I slowly lowered the phone to my mahogany desk, pressing the stop button on the recording app and immediately dragging the audio file into the encrypted, cloud-based FBI dossier I shared with Elias and Arthur. The transactional illusion was complete. They had proven, on a recorded line, that their relationship with me was entirely contingent upon my willingness to be financially abused, entirely erasing any lingering moral hesitation I might have harbored about the absolute destruction I was about to rain down upon their heads. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the freezing expanse of the city, my mind rapidly shifting from the emotional rot of my family to the clinical, surgical precision of the legal strike, mentally reviewing the timeline for the upcoming weekend with the cold calculus of a military general planning an ambush. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Arthur Vance, the line ringing only once before his gravelly voice answered, already anticipating my call. "Arthur, the final piece of bait has been swallowed. They are closing escrow on the Beverly Hills property tomorrow and hosting a massive, highly publicized event on Saturday evening, which means the stolen funds will be completely locked into the fraudulent lease agreement and impossible to reverse," I reported, my voice brisk and professional. "Excellent," Arthur replied, the sound of papers shuffling echoing in the background. "Elias has completely verified the wire fraud trail. We have the forged power of attorney notarization on file. We have the blocked attempt at corporate bank fraud, and now we have audio evidence of him attempting to further extort the victim to fund the proceeds of the initial crime." Arthur paused, the gravity of the legal machinery he was operating bleeding into his tone. "I have my contacts at the FBI White-Collar Crime Division on standby, Charmaine. The moment you give the green light, I will securely transmit the entire dossier directly to the special agent in charge. And given the high-profile nature of the stolen federal tax funds, they will not wait around to issue a simple summons." I knew exactly what Arthur meant. Federal agencies do not politely knock on the door when a six-figure tax embezzlement case is wrapped in a neat, incontrovertible bow. They move with overwhelming theatrical force to secure the evidence and prevent flight, which was exactly the kind of cinematic humiliation my brother and sister-in-law desperately needed to experience. "I want the raid to happen on Saturday night, right in the middle of their VIP housewarming party," I instructed softly, the image of Brittany's smug face shattering before her elite friends flashing in my mind, bringing a deep, resonant satisfaction to my soul. I want every single person they invited to watch them get placed in federal handcuffs, and I want it to happen when they feel completely invincible. Arthur let out a low whistle, clearly impressed by the sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness of my strategy, recognizing that I wasn't just seeking justice, I was seeking a complete psychological leveling of the playing field. "It will be done," Arthur confirmed, his voice laced with absolute certainty. "I will coordinate the timing with the field office to ensure they execute the warrant precisely when the party reaches maximum capacity. But Charmaine, you need to be extremely careful, because when cornered, narcissistic individuals can become highly volatile." I thanked Arthur and disconnected the call, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of peace wash over me, the kind of absolute stillness that only exists in the eye of a hurricane just before the eye wall makes landfall, knowing that the agonizing decades of being the unappreciated, disrespected backbone of a toxic family were finally coming to an end. I stood up from my desk, walking over to the small, discreet closet in the corner of my office, and pulled out a sleek, heavy garment bag containing the dress I had specifically purchased for Saturday night, unzipping it slowly to reveal a flawless, floor-length silk gown in a deep, vibrant shade of emerald green, a color that symbolized wealth, power, and absolute, undeniable sovereignty. I was not going to show up to their fraudulent celebration wearing the drab, conservative corporate slacks they constantly mocked me for. I was going to walk into that Beverly Hills mansion, looking like the absolute owner of the universe, wearing my success like an impenetrable suit of armor, completely untouchable by their petty, jealous remarks. As I ran my fingers over the cool, luxurious silk, I thought about the heavy stack of legal documents currently resting in my locked drawer, the deed to my brother's commercial office, the default notice on my parents' mortgage, and the federal indictment papers that would soon bear Preston's name, realizing that I was no longer merely a participant in their twisted family dynamic. I was the architect of its absolute, undeniable ruin. The flight to Los Angeles was booked for Friday evening, a first-class ticket paid for with my own legitimately earned wealth. And as I packed my bags, I prepared myself mentally for the greatest, most devastating performance of my life, knowing that when I walked through those heavy double doors on Saturday night, I would not be the scapegoat, I would not be the ATM, and I would certainly not be the victim. I would be the matriarch they had created, the unbreakable force they had foolishly taken for granted, and I was going to show them exactly what happens when the woman who quietly holds the world together finally decides to let it completely fall apart. The first-class cabin of the Friday evening flight from Chicago to Los Angeles was a sanctuary of hushed, ambient lighting and the faint, comforting scent of expensive leather, a sharp, profound contrast to the chaotic, desperate energy that constantly radiated from my family. And as I sat in the oversized seat sipping sparkling water, I allowed my mind to detach completely from the emotional gravity of what I was about to do, shifting my entire psychological framework into the cold, strategic mindset of a corporate executive preparing for a hostile takeover. While my parents were undoubtedly wedged into economy seats on a budget airline somewhere over the Midwest, likely complaining to the flight attendants and loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about their son's fictional Beverly Hills real estate empire, I was reviewing the final encrypted blueprints of their absolute destruction on my sleek tablet, marveling at how easily their entire world was going to collapse simply because I had decided to stop holding up the pillars. When I landed at LAX and my private car service whisked me away to a genuine 5-star luxury suite at the Waldorf Astoria in Beverly Hills, a suite paid for with my own legitimately earned wealth, not stolen federal tax liabilities, I didn't immediately go to sleep, but instead opened my laptop to initiate a highly secure, encrypted video conference that Elias Thorne had arranged for me with a private, top-tier corporate security contractor named Desmond. Desmond was a brilliant, fiercely meticulous cybersecurity expert who specialized in penetrating and auditing high-end smart home networks for elite corporate clients. And because I was paying his exorbitant retainer through my shadow venture capital firm, he had absolutely no qualms about executing the specific, highly aggressive digital infiltration I required for Saturday night's final act. The $6 million Hollywood Hills mansion that Preston and Brittany had fraudulently leased with my money was equipped with a state-of-the-art, centrally controlled Crestron audio-visual system, an expensive, highly complex network that controlled every single massive flat-screen television, motorized projector, and surround sound speaker in the house, designed to impress guests with seamless, iPad-controlled luxury. However, Desmond had quickly discovered a fatal, almost embarrassingly amateur flaw in their setup. Because Preston was inherently lazy, technically illiterate, and completely blinded by his own arrogance, he had never bothered to hire a professional to reconfigure the network when he took possession of the rental property, leaving the default administrator passwords completely unchanged and the network entirely exposed to anyone who knew exactly where to look. The infiltration is complete, and the back door is securely propped open, Charmaine. Desmond confirmed over the encrypted feed, his screen sharing a complex, scrolling terminal of code that meant nothing to me, but the confident, predatory smirk on his face told me everything I needed to know. I have full, unrestricted remote access to the primary AV control matrix inside the Hollywood Hills property, meaning that whenever you give the signal, I can instantly lock out their local iPads and wall panels, override whatever garbage music or slideshow they are playing, and broadcast our custom video and audio files to every single screen and speaker in the house simultaneously at maximum volume. I nodded slowly, a deep, resonant satisfaction settling in my chest as I verified the digital payload I had instructed Elias to compile, a devastating, undeniable multimedia presentation containing the bank forensic flowcharts, the fraudulent power of attorney documents, and the damning security camera footage of Preston logging into my parents' Wi-Fi network to commit federal wire fraud. The timing has to be absolute, Desmond. There can be no lag, no buffering, and no technical glitches, I instructed, my voice maintaining that quiet, lethal sovereignty that commanded total obedience. I want the override triggered at precisely 8:58 tomorrow evening, right when the party reaches its peak attendance and the room is packed with all of their fake, high society friends, giving them exactly 2 minutes of absolute, unadulterated public humiliation before the federal government kicks the front door off its hinges. As if perfectly cued by the mention of the authorities, my secure phone vibrated on the desk, illuminating with a call from Arthur Vance, my corporate attorney, who was currently operating out of his Chicago office, but coordinating directly with the federal agencies in California to ensure the trap snapped shut with inescapable precision. I merged Arthur into the secure conference call, his gravelly voice immediately filling the room with the heavy, undeniable weight of federal law. "Good evening, Charmaine. The final pieces are officially in motion on our end," Arthur reported, the sound of a heavy file being closed echoing through his microphone. The United States Magistrate Judge in the Central District of California officially signed the search and arrest warrants at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon, classifying your brother Preston and his wife Brittany as severe flight risks due to the highly liquid nature of the stolen federal funds and their active, documented attempts to secure international yacht charters. Arthur paused, ensuring I understood the sheer magnitude of the tactical operation I had set into motion. The FBI White-Collar Crime Division Field Office in Los Angeles has officially taken the lead, and the special agent in charge has confirmed that they will deploy a full tactical entry team to the Hollywood Hills address. They are not going to politely ring the doorbell and ask for paperwork, Charmaine. They are going to execute a dynamic entry to secure the premises, prevent the destruction of digital evidence, and take both of them into federal custody. The reality of his words hung in the air, cold and absolute, confirming that my brother was not going to get a warning. He wasn't going to get a chance to call a lawyer to negotiate a surrender, and he certainly wasn't going to have the opportunity to beg my parents to bail him out. He was going to be publicly, brutally stripped of his fraudulent power in front of the very audience he had stolen my money to impress. "The raid is scheduled for exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow night," Arthur confirmed, perfectly aligning with the timeline I had just established with Desmond. But the special agent emphasized that you must maintain a safe distance when the breach occurs, because desperate people backed into corners are unpredictable, and we cannot risk you being caught in the crossfire of their panic. I thanked both Arthur and Desmond, disconnecting the secure feed and closing my laptop, allowing the pristine silence of the luxury hotel suite to wash over me as I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, glittering expanse of Los Angeles, a city built entirely on illusions, which made it the perfect poetic graveyard for my family's delusions of grandeur. It was in that moment of quiet reflection, staring at the distant lights of the Hollywood Hills, where my brother was undoubtedly throwing back expensive tequila and acting like a mogul, that my personal phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence with the harsh, familiar chime of an incoming text message from my mother. I walked over, picking up the device, and read the message, feeling a wave of absolute chilling clarity wash over me, permanently freezing any lingering microscopic droplets of guilt I might have harbored about destroying my own parents' lives. Charmaine, the text from Evelyn read, the tone completely devoid of warmth, greeting, or basic human respect. Your father and I just checked into our hotel downtown. Make sure you get to Brittany's new house no later than 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon to help the caterers set up the chafing dishes and direct the valet parkers, because Brittany is incredibly stressed about hosting all of her new VIP friends, and she needs you in the background making sure everything runs smoothly so she can focus on entertaining. I stared at the glowing screen, marveling at the breathtaking, astronomical level of audacity contained within those few sentences, perfectly encapsulating the exact, toxic psychological prison they had kept me locked inside for over 40 years. They genuinely believed that I had wired them $15,000 to cover the catering, yet they still inherently expected me to show up 4 hours early, roll up the sleeves of my dress, and act as the unpaid, invisible domestic help for a woman who had literally stolen my corporate tax money to buy the very house she was currently standing in. It was the ultimate, unfiltered manifestation of the strong black woman trope that had slowly bled me dry my entire life. The expectation that my money, my time, my labor, and my absolute submission were permanently required, but my actual presence as an equal human being was an embarrassment that needed to be kept in the background so the golden child and his fraudulent wife could shine. They didn't want a daughter. They didn't want a sister. They wanted an appliance, a silent, obedient machine that generated wealth and absorbed their stress. And they were so profoundly addicted to my utility that they couldn't even fathom the possibility that the machine had finally developed a mind of its own and was actively rewriting its programming to electrocute them. I didn't reply to the text. I didn't justify my absence. And I didn't explain that I would not be arriving early to serve appetizers to a room full of strangers. I simply set the phone down and walked over to the heavy mahogany desk in the corner of the suite, where 3 pristine, thick manila envelopes rested in a perfectly aligned geometric row. I sat down in the leather chair, turning on the brass desk lamp, and slowly, methodically opened the first envelope, sliding out the crisp, legally binding foreclosure notice issued by Obsidian Holdings, LLC, explicitly stating that my parents' Chicago home was now the sole property of my shadow venture capital firm due to Preston's catastrophic default on the subprime mortgage, a document that carried the immediate non-negotiable power of eviction. I traced my finger over the raised seal, feeling the physical weight of my vengeance, before returning it to the envelope and opening the second one, which contained the formal, executed commercial eviction order for Preston's fake Prestige Realty headquarters, legally signed over to me by his former landlord, permanently erasing his ability to even pretend he had a legitimate business operation to fall back on. The third envelope, the heaviest of them all, contained the meticulously printed, comprehensive FBI financial forensics dossier, a duplicate copy of the exact file Arthur Vance had already handed over to the United States Attorney's Office, serving as the undeniable printed proof of their federal crimes, meant to be handed directly to my parents so they could read exactly how their precious golden boy had orchestrated their complete destruction. I arranged the 3 envelopes into a neat uniform stack, placing them inside my sleek black leather designer clutch, securing the clasp with a sharp, satisfying click that sounded exactly like the locking mechanism of a prison cell door, knowing that these documents were not merely pieces of paper, but the legal, psychological, and financial execution orders for a family that had entirely fundamentally forgotten my worth. The trap was fully primed. The federal agents were briefed and waiting in the wings. The digital override was locked and loaded, and the exact precise parameters of my absolute sovereignty had been definitively drawn in the sand, leaving absolutely nothing left to do but wait for the sun to rise on Saturday morning, knowing that by the time it set over the Pacific Ocean, the entire architecture of my past would be burned to the ground, leaving a beautifully empty, perfectly silent space where my exhaustion used to live. Saturday morning arrived with the brilliant, unapologetic warmth of the Southern California sun filtering through the sheer drapes of my luxury suite at the Waldorf Astoria, painting long golden lines across the pristine white duvet, where I lay in a state of absolute profound stillness, completely undisturbed by the frantic, chaotic energy I knew was currently consuming my family across the city. For the first time in my 42 years of existence, I did not wake up with the immediate, crushing weight of someone else's manufactured crisis pressing down on my chest. I did not immediately reach for my phone to check if my brother had been arrested for an unpaid parking ticket or if my mother needed an emergency cash transfer to cover a bounce check. But instead, I simply lay there, listening to the soft, rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning and the distant, muted sounds of Beverly Hills waking up below me. I ordered an extravagant room service breakfast, drinking freshly squeezed orange juice and eating perfectly poached eggs on a silver platter, allowing myself to be completely fully present in the luxury that I had earned with 2 decades of relentless, grueling corporate labor. A luxury that my family believed they were inherently entitled to steal from me simply because I shared their bloodline. As I poured my second cup of dark roast coffee, my personal phone, sitting on the marble dining table, began its predictable, frantic dance, lighting up with a rapid succession of text messages and missed calls from my mother. Each notification, a desperate, demanding digital tether attempting to drag me back into my designated role as the family mule. "Where are you? The caterers are asking about the power outlets in the kitchen, and I don't know how to work this smart home system." The first text from Evelyn read, sent at precisely 9 a.m, followed shortly by another that stated, "Brittany is having a meltdown because the floral arrangements are the wrong shade of white. Get here right now and handle the florist before she ruins her makeup crying." I read the messages with a detached, clinical fascination, marveling at the sheer, unbreakable conditioning of a mother who was currently standing inside a $6 million mansion, fraudulently leased with stolen federal tax funds. And yet, her primary concern was that her daughter wasn't there to act as a human shield between her golden daughter-in-law and a minor inconvenience with a floral vendor. They truly believed I was on my way, rushing through Los Angeles traffic in a panic, desperate to earn my way back into their good graces by serving appetizers and managing their stress, completely oblivious to the fact that I had already scheduled a deeply indulgent 3-hour deep tissue massage and restorative facial at the hotel's award-winning spa. I spent the entire afternoon enveloped in the soothing scents of eucalyptus and lavender, allowing the skilled hands of the massage therapist to physically work the accumulated decades of tension out of my shoulders, literally and metaphorically kneading away the heavy, suffocating mantle of the strong black woman that my family had forcefully strapped to my back since I was a teenager. As the afternoon gracefully transitioned into the golden hour of the early evening, I returned to my suite to begin the meticulous, almost holy ritual of preparing my armor for the final battle, a psychological and physical transformation that completely rejected the drab, conservative corporate slacks and muted blouses they constantly mocked me for wearing, opting instead for a deliberate, undeniable display of absolute sovereignty. I slipped into the floor-length bias-cut silk gown in a deep, vibrant shade of emerald green, the luxurious fabric pouring over my curves like liquid glass, the color serving as a bold, unapologetic symbol of wealth, power, and the kind of unshakable confidence that cannot be leased, stolen, or borrowed. I applied my makeup with surgical precision, emphasizing the sharp contours of my cheekbones and applying a deep, rich shade of crimson lipstick that felt like a quiet declaration of war before fastening the heavy, solid gold monogram necklace around my throat and sliding the thick silver heirloom ring onto my right index finger, the cold metal serving as a physical anchor to the devastating reality of what I was about to unleash. I carefully packed the 3 manila envelopes containing the foreclosure notice, the commercial eviction order, and the comprehensive FBI financial forensics dossier into my sleek black designer clutch, feeling the physical weight of my family's impending doom resting comfortably in the palm of my hand. At exactly 7:30 in the evening, I descended to the hotel lobby, the clicking of my stiletto heels commanding immediate respectful attention from the concierge staff, and stepped into the waiting, blacked-out Cadillac Escalade I had hired for the night, instructing the driver to take me to the Hollywood Hills address Elias had provided. The drive up the winding, treacherous roads of the Hollywood Hills was a surreal journey through the physical manifestations of extreme wealth, passing iron gates and towering hedges that guarded genuine empires, providing a stark, poetic contrast to the fragile, stolen illusion my brother was currently attempting to project just a few miles away. As the SUV climbed higher into the hills, the sprawling, glittering grid of Los Angeles spread out below us like a blanket of diamonds. I thought about the thousands of Sunday dinners I had spent sweating over a hot stove in my parents' cramped kitchen, scrubbing pots and serving plates to a brother who never once said thank you, and a father who demanded absolute respect while offering absolutely nothing in return. I had always been the foundation, the silent, invisible concrete poured deep into the dirt so that they could stand tall and pretend they were giants. But tonight, I was no longer the foundation. I was the earthquake. And as the Escalade pulled onto the exclusive palm tree-lined street where the rented mansion sat, I could hear the deep, rhythmic thumping of heavy bass vibrating through the pristine night air. The property was a massive, ultra-modern, glass and steel monstrosity, aggressively illuminated by harsh architectural spotlights that practically screamed new money, and the sweeping circular driveway was already clogged with a fleet of rented exotic sports cars and luxury sedans, a pathetic, transparent display of superficial wealth curated entirely to impress a crowd of shallow Hollywood climbers and fake real estate influencers. A team of hired valet parkers was frantically running back and forth, trying to manage the influx of guests, while a pair of heavily muscled private security guards stood by the massive custom-built pivot front door, checking names off an illuminated iPad with the kind of self-important gravity usually reserved for state dinners. My driver smoothly bypassed the chaotic queue of cars waiting for the valet, pulling the massive Escalade directly up to the front entrance with an authoritative aggression that immediately parted the crowd, the driver stepping out to open my door before the valets could even react. When I stepped out of the vehicle, the warm California evening air catching the emerald silk of my gown, a sudden, palpable hush fell over the immediate vicinity, the superficial chatter of the arriving guests dying down as they turned to look at a woman who radiated an entirely different, deeply intimidating frequency of authentic power. I did not look like the exhausted, bitter sister my family had undoubtedly described to their new friends. I looked like the owner of the bank that was about to foreclose on their entire existence, my posture perfectly straight, my expression completely unreadable, and my eyes locked onto the massive glass front door with the terrifying focus of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. I walked toward the entrance, the security guard stepping forward with his iPad, holding up a hand to stop me, his eyes quickly scanning my face before he asked for my name in a gruff, dismissive tone. "Charmaine," I stated softly, my voice completely devoid of the desperate, eager-to-please inflection these guards were accustomed to hearing from party crashers, simply stating my name as an undeniable fact rather than a request for entry. The guard frowned, scrolling through the digital list provided by Brittany, a list that I knew intentionally excluded my name in a final, petty attempt to humiliate me by forcing me to beg my way into a party funded by my own stolen money. But before he could open his mouth to deny me entry, the heavy glass door swung open from the inside. Preston stood in the doorway holding a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, wearing a painfully tight, garish velvet tuxedo jacket that he clearly thought made him look like a billionaire mogul. His face flushed with alcohol and the intoxicating, delusional high of standing in a $6 million mansion that he had absolutely no legal right to occupy. He saw me standing there in the emerald gown, and for a microscopic fraction of a second, the smug, arrogant facade slipped, replaced by a flash of genuine, primal confusion as his brain struggled to reconcile the magnificent, intimidating woman standing before him with the exhausted, compliant sister he had thrown out into a blizzard just 8 days ago. "Char," Preston stammered slightly, quickly recovering his composure and plastering on a fake booming laugh that echoed into the driveway. "You made it, and wow, you actually dressed up for once. I was worried you were going to show up in those boring office clothes again." He turned to the security guard, waving a dismissive hand. "She's good. She's my sister, the one I told you about who was going to handle the catering bill." He stepped aside, gesturing grandly into the cavernous, wildly chaotic interior of the mansion, genuinely believing that his patronizing allowance of my entry was a profound act of forgiveness, completely oblivious to the fact that he was enthusiastically inviting the Grim Reaper directly into his living room. I didn't smile. I didn't thank him. I simply walked past him, the heavy silk of my dress brushing against his velvet jacket, stepping into a sensory overload of booming hip-hop music, blinding strobe lights, and a sea of perfectly manicured, surgically enhanced strangers who were enthusiastically drinking my stolen corporate tax funds. I paused just inside the foyer, my eyes scanning the massive open-concept living area, taking in the towering digital screens mounted on the walls displaying a looping, narcissistic slideshow of Preston and Brittany on the stolen yacht, the expensive catering stations overflowing with gourmet food, and the sheer, breathtaking magnitude of the federal crime unfolding in real time all around me. It was exactly 8:15, which meant I had precisely 43 minutes to let them bask in the absolute peak of their fraudulent glory, 43 minutes to let them feel completely, utterly invincible, before Desmond triggered the digital override and the FBI tactical team completely shattered their glass castle into a million irreparable pieces. The interior of the $6 million Hollywood Hills mansion was a masterclass in aggressive, tasteless excess, a sprawling monument to the kind of profound insecurity that demands constant validation from strangers. And as I glided across the polished concrete floors of the open-concept living area, my emerald silk gown trailing silently behind me, I meticulously cataloged every single piece of evidence that my stolen corporate tax funds had purchased. There was a massive, custom-carved ice sculpture of the Prestige Realty logo, slowly melting onto a silver catch tray in the center of the room, flanked by 2 private sushi chefs, frantically assembling rolls for a crowd of surgically enhanced socialites who picked at the food with absolute indifference, while a pair of aerial acrobats twisted themselves in long silk ribbons suspended from the vaulted ceiling, an absurd theatrical display of fabricated wealth that perfectly mirrored my brother's empty soul. I walked past a towering champagne pyramid where a bartender in a crisp white tuxedo was pouring endless bottles of vintage Moet, picking up a delicate crystal flute, not to drink, but simply to hold as a prop, a physical anchor to ground me in the surreal absurdity of the moment as I scanned the room for the real architects of this tragedy. I found them holding court near the expansive, floor-to-ceiling glass doors that opened out onto the infinity pool overlooking the glittering expanse of the Los Angeles basin. My parents, Carlton and Evelyn, were dressed in brand new, painfully stiff designer clothing they clearly couldn't afford, surrounded by a small circle of polite but visibly bored local real estate developers who were undoubtedly just waiting for an opportunity to pitch their own projects. My father was holding a scotch glass, his chest puffed out with unearned patriarchal pride as he loudly dictated some fabricated story about teaching Preston the value of a hard day's work in his defunct auto shop, completely omitting the reality that he was currently a penniless tenant in a house secretly owned by his estranged daughter. My mother spotted me first, her eyes darting over my expensive emerald gown with a sudden, uncontrollable flash of raw jealousy before she quickly masked it with her usual expression of irritated superiority, excusing herself from the conversation and marching toward me with the rigid, aggressive posture of a warden confronting a disobedient inmate. "You're late," Evelyn hissed under her breath as soon as she was within striking distance, her eyes darting nervously around the room to ensure none of the high-net-worth guests were witnessing her scold her personal ATM. "I told you to be here at 5 to handle the caterers. Brittany has been beside herself with stress, and you waltz in here looking like you're trying to upstage the hostess at her own housewarming party. Go find the head chef immediately and make sure the second course of appetizers is ready to go out. And for God's sake, try to look like you're happy for your brother." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, observing the cheap cubic zirconia necklace she wore so proudly, and instead of feeling the familiar suffocating rush of guilt and the desperate urge to comply, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold clinical pity for a woman who had traded a fiercely loyal, successful daughter for a front-row ticket to a sinking ship. "The catering is being handled exactly as I promised, Evelyn," I replied softly, my voice carrying a smooth, chillingly polite detachment that completely ignored her frantic demands, purposefully withholding the title of mother and watching a brief flicker of confusion cross her deeply lined face. Before she could launch into another venomous tirade about my lack of respect, a shrill, artificially enthusiastic voice pierced the ambient noise of the party, and I turned to see Brittany descending the floating glass staircase like a discount reality television star, flanked by a small posse of sycophantic friends who mirrored her every manufactured expression. She was wearing a skin-tight white sequined dress that aggressively reflected the strobe lights, and securely fastened around her right wrist was the unmistakable heavy diamond tennis bracelet she had purchased with my money, sparkling with the cold, hard reality of federal wire fraud. "Charmaine! Oh my God, you actually made it out to the West Coast!" Brittany squealed, projecting her voice loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear, wrapping her arms around me in a fake, aggressively tight hug that smelled of expensive perfume and cheap desperation, pressing her cheek against mine while her eyes remained dead and calculating. "I'm just so shocked you left your little spreadsheets and your quiet little apartment to come celebrate our massive success. I mean, I know how intimidating this kind of high-level networking environment can be for someone who just works a normal corporate 9 to 5. Her friends giggled behind their champagne flutes, completely buying into the narrative Brittany had spun, that she was the glamorous, self-made mogul and I was the jealous, boring spinster sister who desperately needed a handout to experience the finer things in life. I didn't pull away, I didn't grimace, I simply stepped back smoothly, letting my eyes drop deliberately to the diamond bracelet on her wrist, forcing her to follow my gaze before looking directly into her eyes with a serene, terrifyingly calm smile. "Your new jewelry is stunning, Brittany," I said, my voice perfectly modulated, laced with a lethal double meaning that only I understood. "It looks exactly like the kind of piece someone would buy when they finally stumble into a large, unexpected sum of liquid cash. I just hope you kept the receipt for the insurance claims, because you never know when something so valuable might be suddenly confiscated." Brittany's fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a shadow of genuine unease passing behind her eyes as she tried to decipher the quiet threat hidden in my compliment. but her staggering arrogance quickly overrode her basic survival instincts, and she simply tossed her hair, dismissing my words as the bitter ramblings of an envious sister. "Preston spoils me, what can I say?" she bragged loudly, recovering her composure and waving a manicured hand toward the center of the room. "We just believe that when you work as hard as we do, you deserve to reap the rewards. And speaking of my brilliant husband, I think it's time for the toast." As if on cue, the heavy, thumping bass of the hip-hop music faded seamlessly into silence, replaced by the sharp, authoritative clinking of a spoon against crystal, echoing through the massive Crestron surround sound speakers mounted seamlessly into the ceiling. I turned to see Preston, standing on the elevated landing of the glass staircase, holding a microphone in one hand and his crystal tumbler of scotch in the other, bathed in a solitary, dramatic spotlight that made him look like a cheap televangelist preparing to fleece his congregation. The room fell into a respectful, expectant silence, the hundreds of guests turning their attention to the man of the hour, completely oblivious to the fact that the actual owner of the millions of dollars surrounding them was standing quietly by the champagne pyramid, sipping her drink and watching the clock. "Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the new headquarters of the Prestige Realty Empire," Preston boomed into the microphone, his voice echoing off the glass walls, drawing a round of enthusiastic applause from the crowd of sycophants and hangers-on who were eagerly drinking his free liquor. When Brittany and I first envisioned this massive expansion into the Beverly Hills luxury market, a lot of people told us we were crazy. A lot of people doubted our vision, and a lot of people, even some people in our own family, told us to play it safe and stay small. He paused dramatically, taking a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking directly onto me, a smug, victorious smirk playing on his lips as he prepared to deliver the ultimate public humiliation he had planned for his obedient sister. But true generational wealth isn't built by playing it safe. It's built by having the courage to take massive risks, by manifesting your destiny, and by refusing to let small-minded people dictate your worth, Preston preached, pacing the landing like a motivational speaker. I didn't get here by asking for handouts. I got here by grinding, by leveraging my assets, and by trusting my own genius when absolutely nobody else would. I took a slow sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp, dry taste on my tongue, completely unaffected by his pathetic attempts to rewrite history, pulling my phone from my emerald clutch and glancing at the illuminated screen, noting that the time was exactly 8:56, leaving him with precisely 120 seconds of freedom remaining in his natural life. "I do want to take a quick moment to acknowledge my family who flew all the way out from Chicago to be here tonight," Preston continued, gesturing broadly toward Carlton and Evelyn, who beamed with such intense pride they practically vibrated, completely validating the monster they had created. "My parents taught me the value of $1, and I want to give a special shout-out to my little sister Charmaine, standing over there by the bar, who finally stepped up and chipped in to help cover the catering tonight, proving that even if you don't have the vision to build an empire yourself, you can still play a small, supportive role in helping the real winners succeed." A smattering of polite, patronizing applause rippled through the crowd, dozens of eyes turning to look at me with mild, condescending amusement, expecting me to blush, shrink away in embarrassment, or nod subserviently to acknowledge my designated place at the absolute bottom of his fraudulent hierarchy. Instead, I simply raised my crystal flute toward him in a slow, deliberate, perfectly composed mock toast, my face locked in a serene, chilling smile that completely unnerved him, causing his smirk to falter slightly as his brain failed to comprehend why I wasn't emotionally devastated by his public insult. He didn't know that my silence wasn't submission. My silence was the absolute focused concentration of a sniper who had already pulled the trigger and was simply waiting for the bullet to travel the distance to its target. "So here's to Prestige Realty," Preston recovered quickly, raising his glass high into the air, his voice booming through the $6 million house. "Here's to the future. Here's to never apologizing for your success, and here's to the empire that nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, can ever take away from us." The crowd erupted into cheers, raising their glasses in unison, a symphony of clinking crystal and manufactured adulation that swelled to a deafening crescendo, washing over my brother as he stood bathed in the spotlight, the absolute undisputed king of a kingdom built entirely on sand. I looked down at my phone one last time, watching the digital numbers flip from 857 to 858, a sharp, cold thrill of absolute sovereignty shooting straight down my spine as I slipped the device back into my clutch and took one final deliberate step backward into the shadows near the patio doors. The applause was still ringing in the air. Preston was still smiling down at his adoring subjects, and Brittany was still clutching her stolen diamonds when the massive, centrally controlled digital override I had purchased with my own legitimate wealth slammed into the mansion's network with the devastating, silent force of a freight train. The thumping bass of the hip-hop track was violently severed, completely extinguished in a fraction of a millisecond, and replaced by a deafening, high-frequency electronic feedback screech that ripped through the $6 million audio system, forcing the hundreds of elite guests to instantly drop their crystal champagne flutes and clap their hands over their ears in physical pain. The warm, flattering amber strobe lights that bathed the open-concept living room died instantly, abruptly replaced by the harsh, clinical, blinding white glare of the emergency and maintenance floodlights, instantly transforming the glamorous, exclusive Hollywood Hills housewarming party into the stark, unforgiving reality of a federal interrogation room. Before the panicked murmurs of the crowd could even begin to swell, every single massive 80-inch flat-screen television, every motorized projector screen, and every digital display panel in the house simultaneously flickered to life, completely overridden by the encrypted back door Desmond had propped open. A massive, high-definition digital rendering of the forged power of attorney document materialized on every wall, the fraudulent, shaky signature of my name magnified to the size of a billboard, floating directly above a stark, undeniable header written in bold crimson text that read, "Federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft." The collective gasp from the room of high-net-worth real estate developers and shallow influencers was entirely audible, a unified intake of breath as the screens immediately transitioned, driven by an automated presentation script that Elias Thorne had meticulously designed to be as legally damning and publicly humiliating as humanly possible. The surround sound speakers, no longer playing the soundtrack of my brother's manufactured success, suddenly crackled with crisp, undeniable audio, broadcasting the recorded phone call Preston had made to me just 48 hours ago, his smug, patronizing voice echoing off the glass walls for everyone to hear as he demanded $15,000 and casually admitted to tying up all of his liquidity in the Yacht charter to secure his networking platforms? The digital display seamlessly shifted again, flashing a complex, color-coded forensic financial flowchart that traced the exact path of the stolen $120,000, visually walking the captivated, horrified audience through the theft, showing the money moving from my secure corporate holding account directly into the fraudulent Prestige Realty LLC shell account, before explicitly branching out to show exactly how much was spent on the Oceanic Yacht charter and the predatory balloon mortgage of the very house they were currently standing in. Preston stood completely frozen on the elevated landing of the glass staircase, the microphone hanging uselessly from his limp fingers, his face draining of all blood until his skin matched the pale, sickly color of the melting ice sculpture in the center of the room, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating terror as he watched his entire fabricated empire systematically dismantled and broadcasted to the exact demographic of people he had stolen my money to impress. "Turn it off!" Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria as she dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering against the polished concrete floor, frantically waving her arms at the hired valets and private security guards who simply stood there, completely bewildered and entirely unwilling to intervene in what was clearly a massive, high-level cyber exposure. "Somebody cut the power, rip the cords out of the walls, just make it stop," she screamed, lunging toward the nearest massive television screen and desperately clawing at the sleek, bezel-less frame. But the monitors were perfectly flush-mounted, rendering her pathetic. Panicked efforts completely useless as the screens transitioned once more, this time displaying the denied commercial bank fraud application where Preston had attempted to leverage my corporate employer identification number for $500,000. The elite guests, possessing the ruthless survival instincts of the wealthy, immediately recognized the catastrophic legal toxicity of the situation, their polite smiles instantly vanishing as they began to aggressively back away from the champagne pyramids and the catering stations, instinctively pulling out their smartphones to record the spectacle, while simultaneously edging toward the exits to ensure their own names were not associated with an active federal crime scene. I stood perfectly still in the shadows near the patio doors, my emerald silk gown blending into the ambient darkness of the Los Angeles night, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my dry champagne as I watched my father, Carlton, drop his glass of scotch, the amber liquid splashing across his expensive, unpaid-for shoes as he stared at the massive screens in complete, uncomprehending shock, while my mother, Evelyn, clutched her cheap cubic zirconia necklace, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish as her brain violently short-circuited, entirely unable to reconcile the undeniable, objective proof of her golden son's profound criminality with the flawless, entrepreneurial narrative she had worshipped for decades. Preston finally snapped out of his paralyzed state, violently hurling the dead microphone against the wall and scrambling down the glass staircase, his velvet tuxedo jacket suddenly looking incredibly cheap and pathetic as he frantically shoved his way through the crowd of disgusted influencers, desperately screaming for his private security to locate the main breaker box and shut down the entire grid, but it was far too late for darkness to save him. The digital clock on the bottom corner of the forensic presentation ticked over to exactly 9 o'clock, and before Preston could even reach the electrical panel, the heavy, custom-built pivot front doors of the mansion were violently, explosively breached, flying open with such tremendous, terrifying force that the heavy glass shuddered within its frame. "Federal agents, nobody move! Keep your hands where we can see them!" A booming, mechanically amplified voice roared through the foyer, completely drowning out the lingering echoes of the audio presentation as a coordinated tactical entry team from the FBI White-Collar Crime Division, heavily armed and wearing dark tactical gear emblazoned with stark yellow letters, swarmed into the massive living space with overwhelming cinematic precision. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of the federal raid completely shattered any remaining illusions of a high society gathering, the tactical flashlights cutting through the clinical white glare of the overridden lighting system, as a dozen agents fanned out across the room, securing the perimeter and immediately blocking every single exit with their imposing physical presence, instantly trapping the entire fraudulent court inside their stolen castle. The guests erupted into genuine panic, screaming and dropping to the floor or pressing their backs flat against the glass walls, desperate to demonstrate their compliance, completely abandoning the shallow, sycophantic loyalty they had shown Preston just 5 minutes prior. "Preston Carlton, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and aggravated identity theft," the special agent in charge barked, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute, undeniable authority, as two heavily armored agents zeroed in on my brother, who had frozen dead in his tracks near the catering station, his hands trembling violently as the absolute crushing reality of his situation finally breached his staggering arrogance. No. Wait! There's been a mistake! This is a civil matter. It's a family dispute over a bridge loan. Preston babbled hysterically, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine as the agents descended upon him, roughly grabbing his arms and violently spinning him around to face the glass staircase he had just proudly given his toast from, kicking his legs apart and slamming his chest against the sleek glass railing. "I'm a legitimate businessman. You can't do this to me. My sister just got confused about the paperwork," he sobbed, all of his manufactured patriarchal authority completely evaporating in an instant. But the federal agents completely ignored his pathetic, desperate lies, the sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists, echoing through the sudden, terrified silence of the massive room. Across the room, Brittany was completely melting down, entirely abandoning any pretense of luxury or grace as she thrashed wildly against the female federal agent who had grabbed her arm, shrieking in pure, unfiltered agony as the heavy diamond tennis bracelet she had purchased with my stolen money was violently scraped against the cold steel of the handcuffs being secured around her own wrists. The agent loudly reading her Miranda rights and explicitly charging her as a co-conspirator in the federal wire fraud scheme. "You can't take us. We live in Beverly Hills. We're building an empire." Brittany screamed, her flawless makeup running down her face in thick, dark streaks, her sequined dress looking entirely absurd as she was unceremoniously marched toward the front door, the very same door she had planned to welcome her high society friends through. But the most devastating, profound reaction did not come from the criminals themselves. It came from the enablers. My father, the man who had physically thrown me out into a blizzard to protect this exact illusion, suddenly surged forward from the patio doors. His face flushed a dangerous, violent purple as he completely forgot he was dealing with the federal government and not his subservient daughter. "Get your hands off my son!" Carlton roared, charging blindly toward the tactical agents, genuinely believing his booming voice and patriarchal rage could somehow override a federal indictment. But he barely made it 3 steps before a massive federal agent stepped directly into his path, placing a heavy, gloved hand squarely on his chest and shoving him backward with such effortless, dismissive force that my father stumbled and collapsed hard onto the polished concrete floor, completely stripped of his dignity and power in front of the entire room. "Stay on the ground, sir, or you will be arrested for interfering with a federal investigation," the agent commanded coldly, his hand resting casually on his utility belt, leaving my father sitting on the floor, gasping for breath, completely emasculated and utterly powerless to stop the destruction of his golden child. My mother, Evelyn, fell to her knees beside him, clutching her chest and letting out a guttural, wailing scream that tore through the room, the agonizing primal sound of a woman watching her entire life's work, her entire twisted identity being dragged away in chains, her eyes darting frantically around the room until, through the chaos and the flashing tactical lights, her gaze finally locked onto me. I was still standing perfectly still in the shadows, my posture flawlessly straight, the emerald silk of my gown catching the reflection of the flashing red and blue lights now illuminating the massive driveway outside, completely untouched by the violence and panic unfolding just feet away from me. Preston being aggressively frog-marched toward the exit by 2 massive federal agents, followed his mother's terrified gaze, his eyes snapping to my location in the shadows, and in that exact freezing moment of absolute clarity, the final, devastating puzzle piece locked into place in his mind. He looked at the perfectly calm, terrifyingly sovereign expression on my face. He looked at the heavy, silver heirloom ring on my finger, and he looked at the massive, hacked screens, still displaying the irrefutable forensic evidence of his crimes. and he realized with absolute crushing certainty that the quiet, obedient sister he had constantly underestimated, mocked, and stolen from was not a helpless victim at all, but the ruthless, brilliant architect of his entire annihilation. The smug smirk was permanently gone from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror as he stared at me, opening his mouth to speak, to beg, to apologize. But before a single word could escape his lips, the federal agent forcefully shoved him forward, marching him completely out of the mansion, out of his stolen life, and directly into the cold, unforgiving machinery of the United States justice system, leaving the echoing void of his absence to finally, completely belong to me. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles slowly faded down the winding Hollywood Hills driveway, taking with them the chaotic, deafening roar of the tactical raid and leaving behind a profound, ringing silence that settled over the $6 million mansion like a heavy funeral shroud. The elite sycophantic guests who had been eagerly drinking my stolen corporate tax funds just minutes prior had completely vanished, scattering like roaches into the Los Angeles night the absolute second the federal agents had cleared the exits, entirely abandoning their fake friendships and leaving behind a pathetic wasteland of shattered crystal champagne flutes, overturned catering trays, and the slowly melting absurd ice sculpture of the Prestige Realty logo dripping onto the polished concrete floor. The massive, hijacked digital screens mounted across the walls were still glowing with the stark, blinding white light of the forensic financial presentation, the words, "Federal Wire Fraud," casting long clinical shadows over the open-concept living room, where my parents remained completely paralyzed on the floor. Carlton, the man who had always demanded absolute patriarchal submission and who had physically thrown me out into a life-threatening blizzard to protect his golden son, was sitting slumped against the base of the glass staircase, his chest heaving irregularly, staring blankly at the puddle of spilled scotch on his expensive, unpaid-for shoes, with the hollow, broken expression of a king who had just watched his entire fraudulent kingdom burn to the absolute ground. Evelyn was kneeling a few feet away, her hands pressed over her face as she rocked back and forth, emitting a low, continuous, agonizing moan that completely lacked the theatrical, manipulative cadence of her usual tantrums, sounding instead like the genuine primal grief of a woman whose entire carefully constructed identity had just been violently amputated without anesthesia. I stepped completely out of the shadows near the patio doors, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my stiletto heels cutting through the cavernous silence of the devastated room, my posture flawlessly straight and the emerald silk of my gown flowing behind me like a liquid armor as I walked slowly, deliberately toward the center of the wreckage. The sound of my approach caused my mother to abruptly stop rocking, her head snapping up, her eyes red and swollen, mascara running down her face in dark, jagged tracks as she looked at me. Standing there, completely composed, utterly untouched by the catastrophic destruction that had just swept through her life. "Charmaine," Evelyn gasped, her voice trembling violently as she frantically scrambled to her feet, stumbling slightly on her high heels, completely abandoning her usual tone of irritated superiority and replacing it with a desperate, pathetic pleading that made my stomach churn with clinical disgust. "Charmaine, you have to fix this. You have to call your high-powered lawyers right now and tell the federal agents it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you gave him permission to borrow the money for a bridge loan. You have the power to stop this. He's your brother. He's your blood." I stopped exactly 3 feet away from her, maintaining an impenetrable physical and emotional boundary, my face arranged in a mask of perfectly serene, terrifyingly cold detachment, looking at her not as a mother, but as a deeply flawed, toxic individual who had spent 42 years entirely failing to recognize my humanity. "He didn't borrow a bridge loan, Evelyn," I stated softly, my voice carrying a smooth, absolute finality that echoed off the glass walls, completely refusing to raise my volume to match her hysteria. He committed federal wire fraud. He stole $120,000 of corporate tax liabilities. He attempted to commit a $500,000 bank fraud using my corporate entity. And he deliberately left a digital trail so blatantly incompetent that the FBI barely had to do any actual investigative work to secure the indictment. Carlton let out a pathetic, ragged groan from the floor, finally looking up at me with eyes full of a sudden, desperate realization, his jaw working silently as he tried to summon his old, booming authority. But all that came out was a weak, defeated whisper. "You planned this," my father wheezed, pointing a trembling finger at the hacked digital screens. "You let him spend the money. You came here tonight just to watch him get destroyed. You betrayed your own family over a few dollars." I turned my gaze to Carlton, my eyes locking onto his with the crushing weight of 2 decades of unacknowledged financial sacrifice, entirely immune to his pathetic attempt at guilt-tripping. "You threw me out into a level 3 blizzard to protect a thief," I reminded him quietly, stating the undeniable fact with the emotional indifference of reading a weather report. "You told me I was dead to you. You locked the deadbolt on the only home I had ever known, and you chose the illusion of a successful son over the reality of a fiercely loyal daughter. I didn't betray this family, Carlton. I simply stopped funding its delusions and allowed the federal government to enforce the consequences of your golden child's actions." I slowly opened my sleek black designer clutch, the sharp click of the metallic clasp echoing loudly in the quiet room, and withdrew the 3 thick, pristine manila envelopes I had meticulously prepared in my hotel suite, holding them out in my perfectly manicured hand. Evelyn stared at the envelopes as if they were venomous snakes, her hands shaking so violently she could barely reach out to take them, but my unyielding gaze forced her to comply, her fingers trembling as she accepted the heavy stack of legal documents. The first envelope contains the duplicate copy of the exact forensic financial dossier that my attorneys handed over to the United States Attorney's Office, I explained clinically, watching her eyes widen in horror as she looked down at the thick file. It contains undeniable, objective proof of every single dollar he stole, including the recorded phone call where he attempted to extort another $15,000 from me to pay for the catering you are currently standing next to. He's looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and Brittany is being charged as an active co-conspirator. Evelyn let out a choked sob, clutching the first envelope to her chest as if she could physically absorb the pain of the indictment, but I did not pause, my voice remaining perfectly smooth and relentless. "The second envelope contains a legally executed commercial eviction order," I continued, gesturing to the stack. "That massive, bustling commercial headquarters your son is always bragging about downtown? He hasn't paid the rent in 3 months, and his landlord legally sold the property and the eviction rights to a shadow venture capital firm I completely control, meaning Prestige Realty no longer has an office, it no longer has assets, and it officially ceases to exist." My father pulled himself up, using the glass railing, his face pale and slick with cold sweat, the absolute undeniable reality of his son's complete failure finally penetrating the thick armor of his patriarchal arrogance, but the final, most devastating blow had yet to be delivered. "And the third envelope, Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper that forced both of them to lean in to hear me. "The third envelope contains a formal 30-day notice of foreclosure and eviction for the house in Chicago." My mother froze, the sobbing instantly dying in her throat, her face twisting in pure, unadulterated confusion as she stared at me, her brain entirely failing to process the words I had just spoken. "What are you talking about?" she whispered frantically, shaking her head in denial. "We own that house. We've lived there for 30 years. We pay our mortgage." I offered a small, terrifyingly calm smile, a smile completely devoid of any joy or warmth. "You haven't owned that house for 8 years, Evelyn," I corrected her softly, dealing the final, killing blow to their entire fabricated reality. When you thought you were taking out a traditional second mortgage to fund Preston's failed sneaker boutique, your brilliant entrepreneurial son actually brokered a predatory, subprime loan through a private equity firm in Nevada, using the entire equity of your home as collateral. And he has been running a shadow Ponzi scheme for years just to keep them from foreclosing. I watched the blood completely drain from my father's face, his eyes widening in absolute horrific realization as he remembered the stack of confusing paperwork Preston had rushed him into signing years ago, the realization hitting him that the son he worshipped had secretly, selfishly sold the very roof over their heads to fund a pathetic, failed business venture. Because Preston diverted his available cash to steal my tax money and rent this fraudulent mansion, he missed the last 2 balloon payments on your house, I explained, the mechanics of my vengeance laid bare in the clinical light of the room. The Nevada firm put the defaulted debt up for sale, and Obsidian Holdings, LLC, my private, fully funded venture capital firm, purchased the note in entirely cash. I bought your debt, I hold the deed, I am officially your landlord, and because the loan is in catastrophic default, I am legally seizing the property. Evelyn dropped the envelopes, the heavy manila folders slapping against the concrete floor, the papers spilling out around her designer shoes as she fell to her knees right in front of me, completely shattered, completely broken, entirely stripped of the toxic, arrogant superiority she had worn like a crown her entire life. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands, grabbing the hem of my emerald silk gown, looking up at me with tears streaming down her face, finally agonizingly realizing that she had literally thrown away the only person who had ever truly protected her. "Please, Charmaine, I'm your mother. We're your parents. You can't throw us out on the street. We have nothing. Preston took everything," she wailed, her voice cracking with the sheer unbearable weight of her own catastrophic misjudgments, begging for the exact same mercy she had callously denied me when she locked me out in the freezing snow. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet, feeling no triumphant joy, no bitter anger, and absolutely no lingering sense of obligation. I simply felt the profound, beautiful emptiness of a woman who had finally put down a massive, suffocating weight that was never hers to carry in the first place. I gently but firmly stepped backward, pulling the luxurious silk of my gown completely out of her grasping hands, entirely severing the physical and emotional tether she was trying to desperately reattach. I opened my black clutch one final time, reaching past my platinum credit cards and the keys to my luxury condo, and pulled out a single, crisp $20 bill. I let the bill slip from my fingers, watching it flutter slowly through the air until it landed softly on the polished concrete floor, coming to rest right next to the scattered, devastating legal documents of their ruin. "Take an Uber to a cheap motel off the interstate," I said, my voice echoing with the quiet, absolute sovereignty of a matriarch who had finally reclaimed her throne. "I hear the accommodations are sparse, but the environment is excellent for building character." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't look at my father weeping silently against the stairs, and I didn't look back at my mother kneeling in the ruins of her golden child's empire. I simply turned around and walked out of the massive glass doors, the cool, pristine California night air washing over my face as I stepped into the back of my waiting, blacked-out Escalade, instructing the driver to take me back to my luxury suite, the heavy doors of the SUV closing with a solid, comforting thud that permanently sealed me away from their toxicity forever. 6 months later, the dust had completely settled into a permanent, undeniable reality. A reality where Preston was currently serving a 10-year federal sentence after desperately pleading guilty to avoid trial. His wife Brittany having immediately filed for divorce and turned state's evidence the moment the handcuffs clicked, while my parents were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a dreary Chicago suburb, entirely dependent on Social Security after I legally liquidated their house and deposited the remaining equity into a heavily restricted trust they couldn't mismanage. I was sitting on the expansive, sun-drenched terrace of the stunning, multi-million-dollar beachfront property I had recently purchased in Malibu, with my own legitimate, hard-earned wealth, the gentle sound of the Pacific Ocean waves crashing against the shore, providing a constant, soothing rhythm to my new life. I held a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee in my hands, taking a slow, deep breath of the crisp, salty air, completely alone, completely unburdened, and entirely at peace, marveling at the incredible lightness of being a woman who only pays for her own peace, her own property, and her own joy. I looked out at the endless, glittering horizon, realizing that the greatest tragedy of the strong Black woman expectation is that it convinces us our worth is permanently tethered to our ability to endure abuse and carry the dead weight of those who refuse to walk. But the greatest triumph is the quiet, elegant moment we finally realize we were never meant to be the foundation for their castles. We were meant to be the architects of our own empires.